wind cuts across the brown autumn grass under a sky the color of old bruises. Cow staggers. Falls hard, white foam spills from its mouth. Another drops, then 3, then 6 more. In the cold gray dawn, a lone figure walks among the dying herd. Skirt heavy with mud, hair torn loose by the wind, hands already reaching for the earth. Fingers brush a low gray-green shrub that does not belong here. It grows in a straight row. Not scattered, not natural. Planted. Someone has sown death along the fence line. She rises, turns, runs hard toward the house, breath tearing in her throat. In the yard, men gather with faces set like stone. No one speaks. Only the wind and the shallow breathing of the animals still standing. 6 months remain. A vow made in silence. But she already knows this was never chance. Something patient and deliberate is closing in, and it will not wait for spring. The morning Tabitha left San Carlos, her mother did not cry. She stood in the doorway of the small adobe house, wrapped against the pre-dawn cold, and watched her daughter fold the last of her belongings into a trunk too heavy for its own handles. And she did not cry, because she had decided, sometime before, that crying was a luxury this particular morning could not afford either of them. "You have the recipe cards," her mother said. "Not a question. I have them. And the letter. The one with her name on it. Adelaide Colton's name, I have that too." Her mother nodded, reached out, touched Tabitha's cheek with fingers that trembled now, always, the sickness having taken from them whatever steadiness they'd once possessed, over a grinding stone, a needle, a daughter's face. "You will write," her mother said. "I will write. And you will not let them make you small," her mother said, and here finally, something in her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to show the effort the whole morning had cost her. "You have never been a small person, Tabitha. Do not let a strange house convince you otherwise." Tabitha held her mother's hand against her cheek a moment longer than either of them had planned to allow. "I won't," she said. It was, she would think later, an easier promise to make than to keep. The ride to the agency gate took most of the morning. A borrowed wagon and a driver paid in what little coin the family had left to spare, and Tabitha watched the only landscape she had ever called home shrink slowly behind her the way a held breath shrinks, and did not let herself turn around more than she absolutely had to. At the gate, the agency clerk checked her papers twice, asked her destination, asked her purpose, in a tone that made clear he expected the answer to be a lie, or a mistake, or both. Marriage, she told him, to a rancher near Prescott. The clerk had looked at her a long moment, measuring, the way men in that uniform always measured, deciding how much of her story to believe and how much trouble believing the wrong amount might cause him personally, and then, finally, stamped the paper and waved her through, already bored, already looking past her, to whatever came next in his ledger. That was the whole of it, a stamp, a wave, a gate that opened for her, only because a stranger's name on a piece of paper said it should. She thought about that, riding the rail line north and then the stage west, 3 days of dust and strangers' elbows and her own careful, guarded silence. She thought about how much of her life these past 8 years had come down to exactly that. Papers, permissions, names other people decided to trust or not trust on her behalf, without ever once asking what she thought of the arrangement. A roof, she had written those words to a stranger because they were true, and because true things were the only currency she had left to trade in. She had not written the rest of it, the fear underneath the arithmetic, the small, stubborn hope she'd tried and failed, more than once on that long journey west, to talk herself entirely out of. By the time the stage pulled into Prescott, dust-caked and 3 days weary, she had folded all of it, the fear, the hope, the mother's hand against her cheek, into the same small, careful place she folded everything too dangerous to carry openly. She stepped down into a town that did not know her name, wearing a dress that did not fit right, carrying a trunk too heavy for the porter, and one single sentence held steady behind her ribs, like a promise she intended to keep no matter what waited for her at the other end of it. "You have never been a small person." She meant to prove her mother right. The courthouse in Prescott smelled like dust and old paper, and something underneath that, something like grit that had soaked into the floorboards so many years back. Nobody remembered whose regret it was anymore. Jediah Colton stood in his one good shirt with his hat in both hands, turning the brim slow, like a wheel that couldn't decide which way to roll. He did not look at the woman beside him, not once, not almost. The clerk who married them was an old man with spectacles perched so low on his nose they seemed to be considering a jump, and he read the words the way a man reads a grocery list. Flat, fast. Done. He did not look up either. Not really. Not until the very end, when he asked if there were rings and Jed said no, and the clerk only nodded like he had expected that answer and moved on to the next line in his ledger. Tabitha stood very still through all of it. Her dress was gray, plain. It did not fit quite right in the shoulders, borrowed from a missionary woman 3 sizes larger who had meant well and gotten the measurements wrong anyway. She held her hands folded in front of her, the way she had learned to hold them in rooms where other people were deciding things about her life. Quiet, small, unbothered on the outside. Inside was a different matter. Inside, something in her chest was doing arithmetic, counting a roof, a purpose, a place 3 counties from anywhere that knew her name, or thought it did, since the only name most of Prescott would ever call her was the one a mission school had stitched onto her 12 years ago, like a patch over a hole they didn't understand. Tabitha. Not the name her mother sang to her, that one she kept. That one was hers alone. Nobody in this courthouse would ever hear it. Nobody in this territory had earned it. "I do," said Jed when the clerk asked. 2 words. Flat as a nickel. He said them the way a man agrees to a fair price for cattle he hasn't seen. "Yet I do," said Tabitha when it was her turn. And that was the wedding. That was the whole of it. No rice. No fiddle. No mother crying happy tears in the front pew, because both their mothers were already gone. One from fever 6 years back and one from a wasting sickness that had taken Adelaide Colton slow through an entire winter, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of her but the letter she'd made her son promise to send. They walked out of the courthouse into a white October sky. Jed's wagon waited at the rail, the horse switching flies, indifferent to the fact that its owner had just become a married man. Jed helped her up, his hand under her elbow. Brief. Correct. Nothing more. He did not speak the whole ride out of town. Neither did she. The road ran straight for the first few miles, then began to climb through low hills the color of old rust, chaparral scraping at the wagon wheels, the town shrinking small and gray behind them until it disappeared altogether behind a fold of land. Tabitha watched it go. She did not turn around to watch it longer than she should have. She told herself that. Told herself the town had never been hers to miss. Not really, not in 8 years of being a name on a mission roll and a face nobody troubled to remember past Sunday service. Still, something in her chest pulled backward, even as the wagon carried her forward. "You'll want water before long," Jed said, an hour in. First word since the courthouse. "I'm well," she said. "There's a canteen under the seat," he said, like he hadn't heard her. She didn't argue. She reached down, found it, drank because it seemed easier than explaining she hadn't needed it, and because some quiet, careful part of her recognized the offer for what it was. Not concern exactly. Not yet. Just a man doing the correct thing because his mother had raised him to do correct things, even for a stranger he hadn't asked for. She could work with correct. Correct, she had found, given enough time and enough patience, sometimes grew into something else. Sometimes. Not always. She knew that too. She'd learned it the hard way once from a merchant's son who'd been perfectly correct right up until the moment correctness cost him something. But she was older now. Steer. And this was not that. She hoped it was not that. Hope was a dangerous thing to hand a stranger on a wagon seat 40 miles from anywhere. She knew that better than most. She held it anyway, just a little. Just enough to keep her spine straight and her hands still in her lap, instead of twisting the fabric of her borrowed dress the way they wanted to. Around them the country opened up wide and pale, grass gone gold with autumn, distant mountains blue-gray at the edges like something painted rather than real. It was, she thought, watching it pass, not an unbeautiful place to be a stranger in. That would have to be enough for now. Jed cleared his throat somewhere past the second hour. "My mother would have liked you," he said. Then, as if the sentence had gotten away from him before he meant to release it, he added nothing else, just drove. Jaw tight. Eyes on the road like it owed him an explanation. Tabitha turned the sentence over slowly, the way she turned over everything unfamiliar, testing its weight before deciding what to do with it. "I hope so," she said finally. She didn't ask him why he thought that. She had a feeling the answer, whatever it was, wasn't ready yet to be spoken out loud. Some things needed time before they could survive daylight. Once, near the 3rd hour, he almost asked her something. She saw it gather behind his eyes, the shape of a question forming, unformed, then swallowed back down before it could reach his mouth. "What?" she asked, when the silence around the unasked thing grew too loud to ignore. "Nothing," he said. Then, because apparently nothing wasn't going to hold either. "Your name?" "Tabitha." Is that he stopped again, seeming to hear how the question might land before he finished asking it. "Is that the name I was born with?" she said, finishing it for him, since he seemed unable to. He didn't answer, just waited, the way careful men wait, giving her room to say only as much as she chose. "No," she said. He nodded. Didn't push. Didn't ask the name she'd have given it instead, though she saw, in the careful stillness of his jaw, that some part of him wanted to. That too she filed away. Information. A man who wanted to know more but understood without being told twice when a door wasn't yet ready to open. It was, she thought, not nothing. It might, in time, turn out to be quite a lot. 3 weeks before that, in a ranch house 40 miles east, Jedediah Colton had burned 2 letters before he kept the third. He hadn't meant to keep any of them. He'd meant to burn all 3, the way he'd burned the advertisement itself, the day after the funeral, the day the grief hit him not like sadness but like anger, hot and stupid and pointed at nothing in particular. His mother had placed a notice in 3 territorial papers before she died. Wanted. A wife for a rancher. Hard-working, God-fearing, willing. She had never asked him if he wanted a wife. She had simply decided, the way mothers decide things, that a son left alone on 11,000 acres with nothing but grief and stubbornness for company was a son who would run that ranch and himself into the ground within 5 years. She'd written the advertisements from her sickbed, sealed it, given it to the ranch hand Amos Doyle to post in town, because by then she could no longer make the ride herself. Jed found out about it a week after she died when the first letter arrived. He burned it without opening the second page. He burned the second one too, 3 days later, barely reading past the first line. The third letter he almost burned. Had it halfway to the stove. Actually, flame already caught along one corner when he saw his mother's hand on the outside of the envelope. Not the letter itself, the envelope. Adelaide Colton had addressed each reply herself before she died, penned the destination for whoever would write back, like a woman finishing her own errand from beyond the grave, because she trusted no one else to see it through. Jed put the fire out with his bare hand. It left a small burn on 2 fingers that took a week to heal and a mark that never fully left. He read the third letter standing in the kitchen, in the dark, because he couldn't bring himself to light a lamp for it. The words were plain. Careful, written in a hand that did not waste ink on flourishes. "I am not asking for romance, Mr. Colton. I am asking for a roof and a purpose. I can cook, keep accounts, tend a garden, and work harder than you likely expect from someone my size. I do not require kindness. I require honesty about what the arrangement is, and I will give the same in return." Jed read that line 4 times. It was the first honest thing anyone had said to him since the funeral. Everyone else in Prescott had been so careful with him, so gentle, so full of sympathy dressed up as small talk. "Sorry for your loss. Your mother was a fine woman. Let us know if you need anything." None of them meaning a word of the last part. None of them showing up with so much as a plate of biscuits when the fences needed mending and the herd needed moving and Jed Colton needed, more than anything, one single person to stop treating him like something broken. This woman didn't know him from Adam. And she'd already said more true things than anyone who did. He wrote back before he could talk himself out of it. 2 weeks after the letter was sent, and 1 week before the wedding date they'd settled on by mail, Jed rode into Prescott to file the marriage license and, because the timing put him near the bank anyway, to ask Bennett Whitfield for 90 more days on the note. He should have known better. Bennett Whitfield's office sat above the bank itself, a corner room with 2 windows that caught the afternoon sun in a way that made a man squint no matter where he sat, which Jed suspected was not an accident. Whitfield liked his advantages built into the furniture. "Jedediah," Whitfield said, not rising. "Sit." Jed sat. Whitfield was a neat man, precisely parted hair, a watch chain that caught the light the same deliberate way the windows did. He had the look of a man who had never once, in his whole life, broken a sweat doing anything that mattered, and who had built an entire career out of making sure other men broke theirs instead. "I won't take much of your time," Jed said. "I'm asking for 90 days on the note, just till I get the fall herd sold and moved." Whitfield folded his hands on the desk. "The note comes due on terms your father agreed to," he said, in writing. "I'm not in the business of amending agreements because the weather's been inconvenient." "It isn't the weather," Jed said. "It's cash flow. Same as every rancher in this county deals with come autumn." Whitfield smiled. It did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Then perhaps every rancher in this county should have read the terms of his note more carefully before signing it," he said. "There is, however, a provision. Your father was a sentimental man, in his way. He built in an exception. He said the word exception the way another man might say trap. I know about the marriage clause, Jed said. Word travels. Word does travel, Whitfield agreed. Fast in a town this size. I understand congratulations may be in order. A wedding, I hear. Quite soon, Jed said nothing. He had not told a soul in Prescott about the arrangement. He had barely told Doyle. Whitfield, knowing already, and knowing that fast, sat wrong in Jed's stomach the way spoiled meat sits wrong, a warning arriving after the fact. It's a fine thing, Whitfield went on, when a man finds a way through his difficulties. Truly. I only hope, for your sake, that whatever arrangement you've made proves as durable as the note requires it to be. Marriage is entered into quickly. For reasons of convenience, he spread his hands, mock apologetic. Well, courts have been known to take a hard look at such things, when circumstances make it worth someone's while to ask them to. Are you threatening me, Whitfield? I'm a banker, Jedediah. I don't threaten. I simply read documents very, very carefully, and I make sure other people understand what I've read. He stood then, signaling the meeting's end the way men like Whitfield always did, without ever having to raise their voice to do it. Give my regards to your bride, he said, whoever she turns out to be. Jed rode home with that sentence sitting in his chest like a swallowed stone. He did not tell Doyle what was said. He did not, in the end, tell Tabitha either, not that week, not the week after, not for the better part of a month. He told himself it was because there was nothing to tell yet, no action taken, no danger arrived, only a banker's careful unpleasantness, which was, God knew, nothing new in this county. He told himself a great many things that autumn that turned out later not to be entirely true, because the truth, the plain truth he wasn't yet ready to sit with, was simpler and colder than any of his excuses. He was afraid, not of Whitfield exactly, of what Whitfield's careful smile implied, that somewhere in this arrangement his mother had built for him, out of grief and gratitude and a debt she'd never lived to explain, there was already a man in a corner office with 2 sunlit windows, watching, waiting, doing the same careful arithmetic Tabitha did, except doing it for entirely different reasons, toward an entirely different end, waiting for the marriage to fail. Waiting, Jed understood with a certainty that settled into his bones and did not leave for a long while afterward, for exactly the kind of crack a hasty, convenient, unloving marriage was likely, in the ordinary run of things, to develop. He would have to make sure it didn't. He was not, at that point, entirely sure how. Tabitha had not always expected so little from a marriage, or from a life. Once, and it felt like once upon a time now, a story told about someone else she had believed in more than survival. Her family had lived on land near the San Carlos agency, land that was not quite theirs, and not quite anyone's, in the particular gray country the government had drawn onto a map with a ruler and called a reservation. Her father had been a man of few words and careful hands, a man who could read weather and the color of the sky the way other men read newspapers. Her mother had known plants the way some women know scripture by heart, by feel, by a knowledge passed down so many times it worn smooth like river stone, which flowers meant medicine, which roots meant food when the rations didn't come, or came late, or came short, which happened more often than anyone in Washington seemed willing to admit. Tabitha had grown up learning both. The reading her mother insisted on, taught in secret from a Bible a missionary had left behind, because her mother believed the white man's letters might someday be a weapon her daughter needed, and the older knowing too, the desert's own alphabet. Mesquite pods ground into sweet flour, acorns leached of their bitterness and pounded soft, wild onion, cactus fruit, the particular hour before dawn when certain roots gave themselves up easiest to a digging stick. She had been happy once. She wanted to remember that clearly, even now, even after everything, that there had been a version of her life with laughter in it, with her mother's hands guiding hers over a grinding stone, with her father's low voice telling stories at night that made the dark feel less like a threat and more like a blanket. Then came the winter 8 years back, the one everyone still spoke of in low voices. The blizzard had come down off the mountains without warning, the kind of storm old-timers still measured other storms against. It buried the agency roads under 4 feet of snow in a single night, and by the second morning, 3 travelers caught out on the flats east of the reservation, strangers, white, a rancher's wife and her hired man and a drover none of them had ever met before, were found half frozen in a wash not 2 miles from Tabitha's family's winter camp. Her father had gone out into that storm to bring them in. Her mother had spent 4 days nursing a woman who was, by the second night, more corpse than patient, packing her feet in warmed cloth to keep them from the rot that takes toes and sometimes legs, feeding her broth spoon by spoon through cracked lips, refusing to let her die, though the woman herself, by the third night, had stopped fighting for it. The woman's name was Adelaide. Tabitha had been 17. She remembered mostly the woman's eyes once they opened again on the fourth day, and the way they had filled with tears at the sight of a young Apache girl wringing out a cloth beside her bed. Tears that had nothing to do with the pain in her frost-bitten feet. "You didn't have to do this," Adelaide had whispered. Tabitha's mother had answered for her, in the plain English she used with outsiders. "We help who needs helping. That is all." Adelaide Colton had left 3 weeks later, once she could walk again, riding out with her hired man toward a ranch Tabitha had never seen and a son Tabitha had never met, thanking the family with words that felt, at the time, like they meant something, and promises that felt, at the time, like the kind people make, and then forget the moment the danger has passed. Tabitha had not thought of her again in 8 years, until a letter came to the agency addressed, strangely to her, in a hand she did not recognize, offering a marriage of convenience to a rancher named Jedediah Colton. She had almost thrown it away, too. Then she read the name Adelaide Colton, written near the bottom, and something in her chest went very still. She had answered it, in the end, for reasons that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with arithmetic, because arithmetic was a language Tabitha trusted more than promises. Because a marriage meant a name that could travel through the world without an agent's permission attached to it, what meant the ability to send goods, medicine, money back to families still confined behind lines on a government map. Because her father had passed 2 winters back, and her mother's hands, once so sure over the grinding stone, had begun to shake from a sickness the agency doctor called old age, and Tabitha called something closer to a slow, grinding grief, and there was precious little a daughter with no land, no cattle, and no standing could do about either. She remembered the night, she decided. Not a dramatic night. No thunder, no sign from the sky. Just an ordinary evening in her mother's house, the rations 3 days late again, the fire burning low, because wood was another thing that had to be rationed now, on land that had once, not so long ago, belonged to no one and everyone, and certainly hadn't required a permit to gather kindling from. Her mother had been having one of her better days. Hands steadier, mind clear. "You should go," her mother said, apropos of nothing, staring into the low fire. "Go where? Away from here. Anywhere that will have you. You are 25, Tabitha. You have given this place everything a daughter can give a mother. And it is not enough, and it will never be enough, because this place does not have enough to give back. I would rather see you gone and whole than here, and slowly ground down the way I have been ground down." Tabitha had argued. Of course she had argued. She had said all the things a daughter says, that she wouldn't leave, that her mother needed her, that there was no shame in staying. Her mother had only shaken her head, slow, patient, the way she'd once shaken her head over a girl who ground mesquite pods, too fine or too coarse and needed correcting. "There is no shame in staying," her mother agreed. "There is also no life in it. Not for you. I have had my life, Tabitha. Whatever is left of it, I will spend it the way I choose, and I choose to spend it knowing my daughter went and found something more than this. Do you understand me?" Tabitha had not understood. Not fully. Not that night. She understood it a week later when the advertisement arrived by an odd chance, passed along by a departing missionary to anyone who might read English, and might, in the reading, find some use for it. She understood it more the day she recognized Adelaide Colton's name and felt something old and improbable click into place, like a key finally finding the lock it was cut for. She had gone to her mother with the letter already half written in her mind. "I would be leaving you," she'd said. "That is the truth of it. Whatever purpose I find out there, it means I am not here." Her mother had taken her hand steady, that day blessedly steady, and held it the way she'd held it when Tabitha was small enough to need holding. "Then you will send for me, once you have a roof sound enough to hold the both of us," her mother said. "Or you will send money, and medicine, and whatever else this cursed ration life requires, because a married woman with a name that travels can do things an unmarried woman on this reservation cannot. Either way, you will not spend your whole life waiting for permission to leave a place that was never yours to be trapped in." That was, Tabitha thought now, watching the ranch land unroll past the wagon wheel, the truest thing her mother had ever said to her. She meant to prove her mother right. Whatever it cost her, a roof, a purpose. That was what she'd written, and she had meant every word. What she had not written, could not have written to a stranger, was the rest of it. That she remembered a woman's grateful tears in a snowbound tent 8 years back. That some small, foolish, hopeful part of her believed a debt like that did not simply evaporate. That perhaps, just perhaps, a son raised by a woman capable of that much gratitude might turn out to be a decent sort of man. She had gambled a great deal on a maybe. Now, sitting in the wagon beside him, watching the pale ranch land unroll on either side of the road, watching this silent, sunburned stranger who was somehow, as of an hour ago, her husband, she wondered if the gamble had been foolish after all. He had not once looked at her the way a man looks at something he wants. He had looked at her, if he'd looked at all, the way a man looks at a debt he isn't certain he can pay. Well, she understood that look better than most people alive. She had worn it herself for years. The ranch house came into view an hour before dusk, low and long and weathered gray, the kind of building that had clearly once been loved and just as clearly had gone a long while without anyone having the time to love it properly. A barn stood off to the north, sound but tired. Corals, a windmill turning slow against a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise. And, waiting at the gate, hat already off, face arranged into something he probably believed past for welcome, stood a broad, graying man with a foreman's squint and a soldier's posture even after however many years it had been since he'd worn a soldier's coat. Amos Doyle had run the Colton outfit since before Jed could sit a horse without help. He had buried Jed's father. He had, 3 months back, helped carry Adelaide Colton's coffin to the family plot on the rise behind the house. He did not trust easily, and he trusted new things least of all. He looked at Tabitha the way a man looks at a horse he's asked to buy sight unseen. "Evening, ma'am," he said, voice careful, neutral as a fence post. "Doyle," Tabitha said. "I've heard your name." His eyebrows went up half an inch. "Have you now?" "Mrs. Colton wrote of you kindly. In her letters to my—" She paused, correcting the shape of the sentence before it gave too much away to the arrangement. Doyle's eyes flicked to Jed, a question in them that Jed did not answer. "Well," Doyle said finally, turning to lead the horse through the gate. "We'll see how kindly you speak of me in a month." It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold either. It was, Tabitha understood, exactly as much as a cautious man was willing to offer a stranger on the first evening, and she filed it away the way she filed everything. Information. Weather. Something to be watched, not trusted yet, not distrusted either. Behind Doyle, 3 younger hands had gathered by the bunkhouse door, not bothering to hide their staring. The tallest of them, lean and sun-cracked with a scar through one eyebrow, was called Silas, and he looked at Tabitha the way a man looks at a bill he suspects is about to come due. Beside him stood Jonah, shorter, quicker-eyed, already whispering something to the third. The third was young, younger than the other 2 by years, all knees and wrists and a hunger that seemed to live permanently behind. Boone, he didn't whisper anything. He just watched, quiet, careful, the way boys watch who have learned early that watching costs less than hoping. Jed's mother had run that kitchen like her own small country, Doyle would tell Tabitha later, once trust had bought him a few more words. Since she passed, the meals have gone the way most bunkhouse cooking goes without a woman's hand behind it. Burnt beans, gray meat, coffee that could strip the hide off a mule. None of them expected the new Mrs. Colton to fix that. They expected, if anything, one more mouth that couldn't feed itself, dressed up as a wife. Tabitha said nothing to any of it. She only nodded once at Doyle, looked up at the house, weathered, sturdy, badly in need of a woman's hand the way a garden needs rain after a long drought, and reached for her own trunk before anyone could think to offer. Jed reached first, he said. "It's not heavy," she said, which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, and neither said so. He carried it up the steps anyway, set it down inside the door, stood there a moment too long, the way a man stands when he has run clean out of things he knows how to say. "Supper's whatever's left from noon," he said finally. "I'll show you the kitchen." "I'd like that," Tabitha said, and that for the first evening was the whole of their conversation. A trunk carried, a kitchen offered, 2 people standing in a doorway, strangers wearing the same name now, neither one certain what came next. That night Jed showed her to a room down the hall from his own, his mother's old room, the quilt still on the bed, folded corners, still sharp the way Adelaide had always kept them. He said something about the wash basin, something about the well being sound, something about breakfast not needing to be early on her account. Then he left. Tabitha stood alone in a dead woman's bedroom, in a house full of strangers who did not want her there, 40 miles from the only family she had left in the world, and she did not cry. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would not cry in front of walls that couldn't be trusted to keep a secret. Instead, she unpacked, slowly, methodically, a few dresses, a hairbrush that had belonged to her mother, a tin bottle, battered, tied shut with string, that held recipe cards worn soft at the corners from years of use, her mother's hand on half of them, her own hand copying the rest before the shaking got too bad to read. She set the box on the small table by the window. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house. It ticked and settled the way old houses do. Somewhere below she could hear Jed's boots on the kitchen floor, slow, restless, a man pacing off something he didn't have words for. She heard the front door open. Close, heard him walk the porch a while out into the dark, alone. She did not go to him. Some grief does not want company, only room to breathe. She lay awake a long time, staring at a ceiling she did not know yet, in a house that was not yet hers, married to a man who had not yet looked at her, the way a man looks at someone he's glad to see. A roof, she reminded herself. A purpose. That was the whole of the bargain. She would not let herself want more than that, she would not. Except somewhere under the exhaustion, under the 8 years of careful smallness, under the arithmetic she'd trained herself to trust instead of hope, something small and stubborn was already doing what it had no business doing. Wondering. She told it to be quiet. It did not listen. It rarely did. She rose before the sun, the way she always had, the way her mother had taught her a woman rises before a house full of hungry men if she wants any peace at all in that house. The kitchen, when she found her way to it by lamplight, was exactly as bad as she had feared. Worse, maybe. A cavernous room, built at some point for a household twice this size, its long table scarred with years of knife work and spilled coffee. The shelves held flour gone half to stone, coffee tins scraped down to grounds and dust, a scattering of tins with no labels and less promise. A side of bacon hung in the smokehouse out back, she'd find later, gone slightly too smoky from neglect. Eggs, at least, waited fresh in the henhouse. That was something. She stood in the doorway a long moment, cataloging what was missing the way she had once cataloged her father's failing accounts, back when there had still been accounts to keep, and something in her steadied, the way it always did once the counting started. This, at least, she knew how to do. She built up the fire in the old cast-iron stove, coaxed a temperament out of it that it had clearly forgotten, and while it warmed she went to work. Flour, however tired, could still be saved with enough working. She found a jar of honey gone crystalline in the pantry and set it near the stove to soften. She found, in the yard behind the smokehouse, a scrubby mesquite tree that told her more about this land, in a glance, than anyone at that ranch had bothered to tell her in words. Mesquite pods, dried, ground fine, folded into the biscuit dough with the last of the flour to stretch it further and sweeten it besides. Her mother's trick, her grandmother's before that. A recipe with no name in any book Tabitha had ever seen because it had never needed to be written down. It lived in hands, in memory, in mornings just like this one, on land far from here, with a mother who was still, God willing, alive to remember it too. She worked in silence. The house was quiet around her, dark windows slowly going gray, then gold at the edges. By the time boots started sounding on the bunkhouse steps outside, drawn by a smell that had not haunted that kitchen. In the better part of a year, Tabitha had laid out biscuits with a crumb so light they seemed to want to lift straight off the plate. Bacon crisped just shy of burnt. Coffee, real coffee, made the way her mother had taught her. That did not taste like punishment. Doyle stopped in the doorway first, nostrils working before his eyes had even found her. Behind him came Silas and Jonah, crowding in without waiting to be asked, and Boone, who could apparently smell a decent biscuit clear from the far pasture, was already reaching before anyone had said a word of grace. Nobody spoke at first. That was its own kind of answer. Jed came in last, the way a man comes in when he isn't sure he's welcome at his own table. He took the seat at the head, the one that had been his mother's, the one that had sat empty and wrong all through the winter. He picked up his fork. He took a bite. He set the fork down slow, like a man putting away a hope he wasn't sure he'd earned yet. Twice. Doyle ate 2 biscuits before he trusted himself to say anything, and even then all he managed was a low, considering, He said it the way another man might say a whole paragraph. Jonah elbowed Silas under the table. Silas, for his part, had stopped chewing entirely, staring at his plate like it might vanish if he looked away too long. Boone didn't say anything either. Boone just ate. Fast, then faster, the way a boy eats who has gone hungrier, in more ways than one, than he ever let show. Tabitha stood near the stove, apron still on, hands folded the same careful way they'd been folded in the courthouse. She did not smile. She told herself she did not need their approval, only their tolerance. A woman who could feed 12 hungry men was a woman who earned her keep, and earning her keep was the whole of what she'd signed her name to. She almost believed it too, until Jonah, mouth still half full, asked whether there might be more biscuits tomorrow. If there's flour, she said, plain as she could manage. There'll be flour, Jed said. He did not look up when he said it. It was, she realized, the first full sentence he had spoken to her since the courthouse. Something in her chest, small, stubborn, the same thing she'd told to hush the night before, flickered. Just a little, just enough to notice. She told it once again to be quiet. It listened even less than before. The days took a shape neither of them had planned, though neither said so out loud. Tabitha rose before dawn and worked that kitchen the way a woman reclaims ground that's been left too long to rot, scrubbing shelves. Nobody had scrubbed in a year, mending a hinge on the pantry door herself rather than ask for help, coaxing that old stove into a temperament she alone seemed able to trust. She learned the ranch fast, learned it the way she'd learned everything worth knowing, by watching, by counting, by keeping careful, quiet track. She learned Silas ate light and fast, like a man who'd once gone a long while without, and never quite trusted a full plate to stay full. She learned Jonah would take seconds if offered, but was too proud, most days, to ask. She learned Boone had lost his own mother 3 winters back to a fever that took half the county that year, and that he ate like every meal might be his last, though these days it was habit more than hunger. She learned Doyle favored his left knee, and shouldn't be climbing the loft ladder twice a day, though he'd sooner eat his own hat than admit it. Boone she watched closest of all, though she never let him catch her at it. He was 17, Doyle told her once, though he carried himself older, the way boys do, who've had to grow into their grief faster than their boots. His mother had died of the same fever that took half the county 3 winters back, and his father, from what Doyle would say, and mostly wouldn't, had never much been around even before that. Boone did not talk about any of it. He talked about cattle, mostly, and the weather, and once, briefly, unguarded, about a dog he'd had as a boy that had died of old age the same month as his mother, so that in his memory the 2 griefs had folded together into one, and he could no longer entirely separate missing one from missing the other. Tabitha started leaving him the crisped edges of the bacon, the pieces the other men didn't fight over. Small thing. Nothing anyone would remark on. She started too, remembering the particular way his mother apparently used to make cornbread, sweeter than most, a detail Boone let slip once without meaning to, and then went very quiet after, as if he'd handed over something he hadn't meant to spend. Tabitha did not push. She simply made cornbread that way the following week, guessing at the proportions, working from nothing but a boy's half sentence, and her own careful sense for what sweetness a grieving palate might remember as love. Boone took one bite and went still. He did not finish his sentence about how his mother used to make it that way too. Nobody at the table pushed him to. Some grief does not want company. Only acknowledgement offered quiet, and then left alone to do its own slow work. Silas warmed slower. He was the kind of man who trusted actions over words. Having apparently been burned, at some point, Tabitha never learned the particulars of, by someone who'd been generous with the second and stingy with the first. He said little to her directly for the better part of 3 weeks, though she noticed he'd taken to fixing the sagging step by the kitchen door without being asked, and she understood the gesture for what it was. A different language. The only one he trusted enough to speak in. Jonah came around faster, mostly because Jonah came around fast to most things, sunny by nature in a way that seemed almost stubborn on a ranch that had spent the better part of a year mourning. He teased Boone about the cornbread until Boone threatened him with the poker, and he teased Tabitha too, carefully, testing the ground the way a man tests ice before he trusts his full weight to it. "You cook like this every day, ma'am," he said one morning, "or is this a trick to soften us up before you start working us to death?" "Both," Tabitha said without missing a beat. Jonah laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, and something in the kitchen shifted after that. Some final wall coming down, that none of them had quite noticed, was still standing. She noticed all of it, not out of nosiness. Out of a habit of care so old, she no longer noticed she was doing it at all. Jed noticed her noticing. He noticed the mended hinge before he noticed the woman who'd mended it. Then slowly, the way frost gives up a window pane, Not all at once but in patches. In careful thaws he noticed both. She noticed things beyond the men too. The kitchen garden, when she found it behind the house in her first week, was little more than a square of hard-packed dirt gone to weed. Whatever Adelaide had once grown there abandoned, since the illness took her strength for anything beyond the essential. Tabitha turned the soil herself, evenings, after supper was cleared, working by the last light before dark, because a garden untended was a kind of grief too, and she understood grief well enough to know it sometimes needed hands busy with something living to keep from curdling into something else. She planted what she knew: squash, beans, a corner given over to the wild herbs she gathered from the scrub beyond the fence line plants. Most of the ranch hands walked past 100 times a week without seeing, the way a person stops seeing anything too familiar to remark on. Doyle caught her out there one evening, digging up something low and gray-green near the wash. "That's just weed, ma'am," he said. "Nothing there worth the bother." "It isn't weed," Tabitha said. "It's medicine if you know how to use it. Poison if you don't. Same plant. Depends entirely on the hand that picks it and how much and what for." Doyle looked at the plant a long moment, then at her, something shifting behind his eyes that wasn't quite trust yet but was, perhaps, the beginning of the road toward it. "Where'd a person learn a thing like that?" he asked. "From a mother who thought her daughter ought to know the difference," Tabitha said, "between what heals and what harms." Said the two were closer neighbors than most folks liked to believe, and a person who couldn't tell them apart was a person at the mercy of whoever could. Doyle grunted, non-committal, the way he responded to most things that made him think harder than he'd planned to that day. He did not forget it, though. Tabitha cataloged the plants around the ranch the way she cataloged everything, quietly, thoroughly, without announcing that she was doing it at all. Which roots grew thick near the North Spring, which low shrubs, if a cow grazed too heavy on them during a lean season, could sicken a whole herd before anyone understood why. Which berries, deceptively sweet-looking, had put an end to more than one careless dog on this land, long before she'd ever arrived to name the danger. She did not think, cataloging it all that autumn, that the knowledge would matter beyond the garden and her own quiet peace of mind. She would think differently before the year was out. For now, though, it was simply what she knew, what she'd always known. The desert's own alphabet, spoken fluently by a woman most of this county had already decided, without asking, couldn't possibly know anything worth knowing at all. They would learn otherwise. Everyone in time learns otherwise about something. He was not an easy man to read, and Tabitha did not try to force it. She had learned a long time ago that pushing at a closed door only made a man lean harder against it from the other side. So she did not push. She only kept cooking, kept counting, kept the plate on the stove covered for the nights he came in late from the fence line, long after the others had gone quiet in the bunkhouse. She never mentioned that she waited up to hear his boots on the porch before letting herself sleep. One night in the second week he found the plate, and beneath it, at the edge, half a slice of dried apple pie, made from the last of a forgotten jar in the cellar. He ate standing at the counter in the dark, not wanting to wake her, not knowing she was awake anyway, listening from the next room, learning the particular silence of a man who did not know how to say thank you, and so ate slowly instead, like the eating itself might do the saying for him. The gossip started the way gossip always starts in a small town, quietly, in the mercantile, after church, carried by women who had daughters, or nieces, or careful hopes of their own that Jed might have married differently, might have married closer to home, might have married someone whose name didn't need explaining. Chief among them was Prudence Whitfield. The banker's wife arrived at the Colton Ranch on a Thursday, a few weeks into the marriage, in a buggy too fine for the road it had traveled, wearing a smile that sat on her face like something pinned there rather than felt. She carried a basket of preserves she'd clearly bought rather than made, and an expression of neighborly concern so carefully arranged. It might have been rehearsed in a mirror, which Tabitha would come to suspect it likely had been. "Mrs. Colton," Prudence said, stepping down without waiting to be helped. "I simply had to come see for myself. The whole county's been talking of nothing else." "Talking of what?" Tabitha asked, though she had a fair idea already. "Why, of you, dear." Prudence's eyes moved over her, the way a buyer's eyes move over livestock. The dress, the hands roughened from kitchen work Prudence's own hands had likely never touched. The plain, unbothered set of her face that gave nothing away. Married sight unseen, and to a Colton no less. It's quite the romance, or quite the arrangement. I never can tell which word people mean when they say it. Tabitha poured tea, careful, Steady. It's a marriage, Mrs. Whitfield, she said. I find one word generally serves as well as another, once the vows are said. Prudence's smile thinned by a fraction. Tabitha doubted anyone else would have caught. Of course, she said. Of course. I only hope Jedediah explained clearly what's expected of a rancher's wife out here. It's a difficult life for someone not raised to it. The isolation, the work. She glanced around the kitchen with an expression that suggested she found it charming, the way one finds a child's drawing charming, pleasant enough, but nothing to be taken seriously. I do hope you're managing. I'm managing, Tabitha said. She did not elaborate. She had learned a long time ago that women like Prudence Whitfield fed on elaboration the way a fire feeds on kindling, and the surest way to starve a fire was to withhold the wood. Prudence stayed the better part of an hour, circling questions that were not quite questions, observations that were not quite insults, all of it delivered with a warmth so precisely calibrated it might have been measured with a scale. She asked about Tabitha's people, asked it lightly, the way one might ask about weather, though her eyes sharpened at the answer in a way that told Tabitha the question had never been light at all. San Carlos, Tabitha said. My family is there still. How trying that must be for you, Prudence said. To be so far from everything familiar, I managed, Tabitha said again. She was aware, the whole visit, of a second pair of eyes, Bennett Whitfield's, though the man himself was 40 miles away in his sunlit office. She could feel his questions in his wife's questions, his careful reading of documents in his wife's careful reading of a kitchen, a dress, a face that gave nothing away. She understood, with the same cold clarity she brought to every ledger, that this visit had not been Prudence Whitfield's idea alone. It had been sent. When Prudence finally rose to leave, she paused at the door, glancing back with an expression Tabitha would come to know very well over the months that followed, pleasant on the surface, and underneath it patient, calculating. A woman used to winning slow. You must come to the autumn social, Prudence said. The whole county will be there. It would be such a chance for everyone to properly meet you. I'd like that, Tabitha said, which was, at the time, almost entirely true. She would want to know her enemy's ground before she was made to stand on it. That much, at least, arithmetic had taught her. After the buggy pulled away, Doyle appeared in the kitchen doorway, having apparently found urgent business near the porch for the better part of an hour. That woman, he said, is trouble dressed up as manners. I gathered, Tabitha said. Her husband holds paper on half this county, Doyle said, including us. Though I don't reckon Jed's told you the particulars yet. Something in Tabitha's chest went carefully, quietly still. He hasn't, she said. Not all of them. Doyle looked at her a long moment, weighing something behind his eyes. Well, he said finally, man tells things in his own time, or he don't tell them at all. Either way, best you go on, knowing that woman didn't drive 40 miles out here for the pleasure of your company. Whatever she's after, she'll be back for it. He was, Tabitha would come to learn, entirely correct. He tried to help her once. It went, by any fair account, badly. It was a Sunday, the one day the men mostly kept to themselves, and Jed had come into the kitchen looking for coffee and found Tabitha up to her elbows in bread dough, flour dusted clean across one cheekbone in a way she was entirely unaware of, and he was entirely unable to stop noticing. I could help with that, he said. Tabitha looked up, considered him, considered the bread, apparently the wisdom of the offer. You don't need to, she said. I want to, he said. It was, she would think later, one of the more surprising sentences she'd heard him say since the courthouse. She handed him a portion of the dough before either of them could think better of it. He approached it the way he approached most things, directly, with more force than finesse. Gently, she said, after the first attempt sent a small cloud of flour up between them like a startled bird. You're not wrestling a calf. Feels a fair amount like wrestling a calf, Jed said. Calves don't rise properly if you handle them like that. Neither do I. Most mornings, Jed said, and something in his face did a thing Tabitha hadn't seen it do before, a small, unguarded flicker, gone almost before she caught it, that she understood, with some surprise, to be the shadow of a joke. She laughed, once, startled out of her before she could catch it. Jed looked for a moment more pleased with himself than the small joke strictly warranted. Fold it, she said, demonstrating. Don't punish it. He tried again, folded too hard. The dough stuck to his hand in a way that made him hold it up, betrayed, like the dough had personally wronged him. This is defective bread, he said. The bread is fine, Tabitha said. The hands are the problem. I'll have you know these hands have roped 1,000 head of cattle without complaint. Cattle don't complain, Tabitha said. Bread does. Quietly. In the eating. Jed stared at his flour-crusted hands like a man reconsidering several life choices at once. I withdraw my offer of help, he said finally. Accepted, Tabitha said, already reaching to take the dough back before it suffered further. Their hands met over it, briefly flour and warmth, and the particular clumsy intimacy of two people who had shared a name for 6 weeks and precious little else. Neither pulled away as fast as either might have, a month earlier, expected to. For your information, Jed said, after a moment, still not quite moving his hand, my mother always said I had my father's hands. Good for fence work, bad for anything requiring a light touch. Your mother sounds like she was an honest woman. Brutally, Jed said. Ask anyone. Tabitha smiled, a real one, small, unguarded, the kind she hadn't let many people see in the better part of 8 years, and went back to the dough alone, though she noticed, with some private amusement, that Jed did not leave the kitchen for the better part of an hour after that. He sat at the table instead, drank his coffee slow, watched her work with an attention he made a poor show of pretending was about anything other than her. Boone wandered in near the end of it, took one look at the flour dusted across half the kitchen, and asked, with the particular bluntness of a boy who hadn't yet learned to be tactful about such things, whether the two of them had been fighting. Baking, Tabitha said. Looks like fighting, Boone said. It was both, Jed said, and Tabitha laughed again, that same startled, unguarded sound, and did not notice or noticed, and did not mind that Jed was watching her laugh, the way a man watches something he's beginning, slowly, cautiously, to hope he might be allowed to keep. It was Doyle in the end who told her the rest of it. Not all at once. Doyle wasn't built for all at once. He told it the way he told most things, sideways, over the course of a week, a sentence here, a sentence there, dropped between chores like a man leaving a trail of crumbs he wasn't sure he wanted followed. He told her about the blizzard. 8 years back, he said, out by the corral one evening while Tabitha mended a torn cinch strap she'd insisted on fixing herself. Worst storm this county's seen before or since. Mrs. Colton went out to visit her sister 2 counties over and got caught in it coming home. Her and her hired man both, like to have died out on the flats. Tabitha's hands went still on the leather. Doyle didn't notice or didn't let on that he had. He kept talking the way men do when they've finally decided a story is worth the breath. Some Apache family took them in, he said. Nursed the missus back from about as close to dead as a body gets, still comes back. She never did stop talking about it. Wrote them letters for years after. Best she could, though I don't know as they ever much wrote back. She used to say the mail out that way wasn't reliable, agency being what it is. He shook his head. Old woman had a memory like a steel trap and a heart to match. Never forgot a kindness done to her long as she lived. Used to say a debt like that don't get settled with money. Only with the same kind of kindness, paid forward when the moment comes round to pay it. Tabitha sat very still. She thought of a woman's tearful eyes in a snowbound tent, of her mother's hands wringing out a cloth, of a promise that had felt, at 17, like the kind people make, and then forget. She had not forgotten, Tabitha thought. She had spent 8 years remembering, and then she wrote a letter to a stranger 3 counties over, offering her only son to a debt she never told him he owed. Ma'am? Doyle was looking at her now, brow creased. You gone pale on me, I'm well, Tabitha managed, just remembering something. She did not tell him what, not yet. She needed first to decide what it meant. Whether the woman lying frozen in that tent 8 years ago had somehow, without ever knowing it, chosen the exact stranger who would one day nurse her back, chosen her, specifically, through a chain of memory and gratitude neither of them could have predicted, or whether it was only coincidence, the kind the world hands out sometimes, cruel and kind in the same careless breath. She did not believe much in coincidence. She believed mostly in debts, in the way kindness, once given, tends to find its way back around, slower than a person expects, and never quite in the shape they imagined. She told Jed that night, waited until the kitchen was empty, until the last plate was dried and put away, until it was only the two of them and the lamp burning low over the table where, 3 weeks ago, 12 men had gone silent over a pot of stew. Your mother, she said, she was caught in a storm once, 8 years back. Jed looked up slow. How do you know about that? My family took her in. The room went very quiet. Jed set down the cup he'd been holding, slow, his knuckles gone pale around it. That was you, he said. It wasn't a question exactly. More like a man saying a fact out loud to see if it would hold his weight. My mother, Tabitha said. Mostly. I was 17, I helped where I could. Jed didn't say anything for a long moment. His jaw worked once, twice, the way it had that first morning over the biscuits. A man trying to find the door in a wall he hadn't known was there. She talked about you people, he said finally. For years, never stopped. I used to think it was just he stopped, started again. I didn't know the letter went to you. I didn't know she knew. I thought it was chance. Some newspaper somewhere. Some agency post. It wasn't chance, Tabitha said, quiet. No, Jed said. I don't reckon it was. He looked at her then, really looked the way he hadn't quite let himself since the courthouse steps. Something in his face had shifted, not softened exactly, not yet, but opened. A door that had been shut so long the hinges had forgotten how to move, moving anyway, slow and reluctant, and real. I didn't marry you to pay a debt of hers, he said. I want you to know that to pay. I know, Tabitha said, but I understand it better now, he went on. Why she wrote what she wrote. Why she was so. He shook his head, searching, certain, about all of it, about you before she'd ever laid eyes on you. Tabitha felt something loosen in her chest, small and careful, like a knot worked slow by patient hands. She did not let it show on her face. Old habits held fast even now. Your mother did a kindness once, she said. It seems it found its way back around. That's all this is. That's all it needs to be. She believed it when she said it. She would not believe it. Not fully. Not for very much longer. The letter came on a Tuesday, carried out from town by Doyle after a trip for supplies. And it wasn't addressed to Jed at all. Not really, not in the way that mattered. It was addressed to Colton Ranch, care of the estate of Adelaide Colton, from the law offices of Whitfield and Marsh, Prescott. Jed read it standing in the yard, hat pushed back, and Tabitha watched his face go still in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. What is it? She asked. Jed didn't answer right away. He read it a second time. A third. Not because the words were unclear. Because some part of him had spent all autumn hoping to find a way through this before the specifics ever came looking for him first. And here they were, in black ink, refusing to wait any longer. My father's will, he said finally. There's a clause in it. Water rights on the north section, the section that feeds 3 other ranches downstream, not just ours. They're tied to a note my father took out years back. Whitfield's bank holds the paper. Tabitha waited. The note comes due the year I turn 30, Jed said. There's a provision. If I'm married by then married and the marriage stands, the rights transfer clean to me, no further payment owed, on account of some arrangement my father made when he first took the loan. If I'm not, he stopped. If you're not, Tabitha said. If I'm not, the note calls due in full and there's no earthly way I can pay it. The rights go to the bank instead. Whitfield's bank. He looked at the letter again like it might read different the second time. I turned 30 in April, he said. Tabitha did the arithmetic, the way she did all arithmetic, fast and cold and clear, 6 months. And she understood, in that same instant, with a clarity that settled into her stomach like a stone, dropped down a well, exactly why a rancher's mother, dying careful, certain, had written an advertisement for a wife instead of leaving her son to grieve alone, as she'd always claimed. It hadn't only been grief she was guarding against. She'd have known the terms of that will. She'd have understood, better than anyone, exactly what her son stood to lose if 30 came and went with him. Still unmarried and still, in his stubborn grief, unwilling to consider it. Tabitha thought of the letter she'd received. I am not asking for romance, Mr. Colton. I am asking for a roof and a purpose. She wondered, standing there in the yard with the autumn light, going long and gold across the pasture, whether Adelaide Colton had chosen her out of gratitude alone, or whether a dying woman, doing careful arithmetic of her own, had understood that gratitude and necessity could, if a person was patient and clever enough, be made to serve the very same letter. She did not say any of this to Jed. Not yet. She only asked, quiet, does the bank know the terms as well as you do? Jed's jaw tightened. Bennett Whitfield wrote the note himself, he said. He's known the terms longer than I have. Doyle found them there a few minutes later, drawn by something in the stillness of the yard that read wrong even from a distance. He took one look at Jed's face, then at the letter still gripped in his hand, and his own expression went carefully, deliberately blank, the look of a man who has seen enough hard news in his life to recognize its shape before anyone says a word. What is it, he said. Jed told him. Flat, fast. The way a man delivers news he hasn't yet found a way to feel anything about. Doyle was quiet a long moment. Your daddy told me about that clause years back, he said finally. Never thought it'd come to matter. Man makes provisions like that thinking they're just paper. Insurance. Never thinking his own son might have to live inside the fine print someday. He looked at Tabitha, something new than his face, not quite an apology, but close kin to one. "Reckon I owe you different thanks than I've been giving," he said. "Seeing as you're the one holding this outfit together, whether you knew it or not going in." "I didn't know it," Tabitha said. "Not until just now." Doyle nodded, slow, chewing on that. "Whitfield's a patient man," he said. "Patient and thorough. If he's known the terms this long, he'll have thought past just the note itself. Man like that don't build one trap when he can build three." "What do you mean?" Jed asked. Doyle's jaw worked the way it did when he was deciding how much of a thought to say out loud before he'd finished thinking it all the way through. "I mean, a marriage entered quick, for reasons of convenience, is a marriage a clever lawyer can pick at," he said finally. "If it ever came down to proving it in front of a judge. Whitfield strikes me as exactly the sort of man who'd know that, and exactly the sort who'd be patient enough to wait for the proving." The yard went quiet again, save for the wind moving steady through the dry grass. "Then we'll give him nothing to pick at," Tabitha said. Both men looked at her. She said it plain, certain, the same voice she'd used the first morning over the biscuits, the one that didn't ask for approval, only stated a fact and let the room decide what to do with it. "That's easier said, ma'am," Doyle said, not unkindly. "Most things worth doing are," Tabitha said. Somewhere behind them, up on the rise where his mother lay buried under a stone that still looked too new, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like something exhaling. Tabitha looked at her husband, this quiet, careful, grieving stranger she had married 3 weeks ago for a roof and a purpose, who had, without either of them quite intending it, become something else to her these past weeks. Something she hadn't let herself name, and she understood, with the same cold clarity she brought to every ledger she'd ever kept, that the marriage she'd entered into as a simple trade had just become something far more dangerous than either of them had bargained for. A debt repaid, a ranch at stake, and a banker in town who had known all along exactly what a dead woman's letter had been written to prevent. "We'll manage it," Jed said, though his voice didn't sound entirely certain it believed itself. "We will," Tabitha said, "because we have to." And because, though she didn't say this part aloud either, she had learned a long time ago that arithmetic alone rarely won a fight like the one she suspected was coming. Arithmetic told you the size of the danger. It never told you how to survive it. That, she was beginning to understand, would take everything else she had. The kitchen, the counting, the quiet, careful watching that had gotten her this far. And whatever this new, stubborn, unquiet thing was that had taken root in her chest since that first silent morning over a pot of biscuits, the thing she had told twice now to be quiet, and that had, twice now, refused to listen. She had a feeling it wasn't finished refusing. She had a feeling, standing in that yard with the wind moving through her husband's mother's grave grass and Aunt Bank's shadow falling long and early across a ranch that wasn't safe yet, wasn't safe at all, that none of them were anywhere close to finished. 40 miles away, in a corner office with 2 sunlit windows, Bennett Whitfield read a short notice in that week's Prescott paper, a marriage announcement, 4 lines, easily missed by anyone not looking for it, and set his coffee down with the same careful precision he brought to everything. Jedediah Colton, the notice read, to Tabitha, late of the San Carlos agency. Married by license October last. Whitfield read it twice. Then he folded the paper, neat along its existing crease, and allowed himself a small, private smile, the kind a patient man allows himself when a piece he has been waiting on finally moves into position on the board. He had half expected Colton to let the whole matter slide past unaddressed. Grief did that to some men, made them careless of their own interests, right up until the interests came due, and there was nothing left to do but lose gracefully. He had not expected a marriage this quickly, nor one quite so. He searched for the word, found it, turned it over with some satisfaction unconventional, that, in Whitfield's long experience, was very often the most useful kind. Marriages built on grief and convenience and haste had a particular shape to them in his observation, a shape that, given the right pressure, applied patiently, in the right places, at the right time, tended eventually to crack. He had time. April was a long way off yet. He drew a fresh sheet of paper toward him, dipped his pen, and began, unhurried, to write a letter to his wife. "My dear Prudence," it began, "I understand congratulations are in order for our neighbors at the Colton Ranch. I wonder if you might find occasion, in the coming weeks, to pay the new Mrs. Colton a welcoming visit. Outside his window, The Prescott streets went on about their ordinary business, indifferent to the quiet, careful war already being planned above them. 40 miles east, in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and rising bread, a woman who did not yet know the shape of the enemy, gathering against her, set a covered plate on the back of the stove for a man who was slowly, cautiously, beginning to come home to more than just a house. Neither of them knew yet how much that plate, that small, quiet, daily kindness would end up costing them both before the year was through. Neither of them knew how much it would end up being worth. The first cow went down on a Tuesday morning, quiet, in the north pasture, near the fence line closest to town. Nobody thought much of it. Cattle went down sometimes. Old age, bad grass, a bloat that worked itself out by supper. Except this one didn't get up. Silas found her at dawn on his usual round and rode back to the house at a pace that told the whole yard something was wrong before he'd said a single word. "She's breathing strange, Mr. Colton," he said, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. "Foam at the mouth. Legs won't hold her," Jed rode out himself. Looked at the animal a long time, crouched low, hat pushed back, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want the answer to. "Could be locoweed," he said finally, "though I don't recall seeing much of it out this way before." "Could be," Doyle agreed. Didn't sound convinced. And by Thursday there were 3 more lying the same way, legs folded wrong beneath them, breath coming shallow and fast, froth at the mouth that hadn't been there Tuesday. Doyle rode out at dawn Friday and came back with his face set hard. 6 more down overnight, he said. Whole north herd spooked. "Something's wrong out there, Jed. Something ain't natural." Jed's jaw went tight the way it did when a thing had already cost him more than he could afford to lose twice in one season. "Vet's 2 days out from Prescott," he said. "Might be too late by the time he gets here." "Might be too late already," Doyle said. Tabitha, standing at the stove, said nothing. She set down the spoon she'd been holding. Carefully, the way a person sets down something before their hands start shaking too badly to hold it steady. She was already reaching for her shawl. She walked the north pasture at first light, alone, because she had asked to go alone, and because Doyle, after one long look at her face, had decided not to argue. The grass out there was late autumn brown, cropped low by hungry mouths, and Tabitha moved through it slow, careful, reading the ground the way her mother had taught her to read it, not with her eyes only but with her whole body, bent low fingers moving through stem and root and the particular bitter smell that clung to certain patches and not to others. She found it near the wash. A low shrub, gray-green, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime learning the difference between what fed a body and what quietly, patiently, unmade it. Because she knew this plant, because her mother had shown it to her once, years back, pointing with a stick instead of a hand, the way a person points at something dangerous enough to deserve distance even in the pointing. This one, her mother had said. Sweet enough a hungry animal won't think twice, kills slow. Kills quiet, a rancher who doesn't know his own land might lose half a herd before he ever thinks to ask why. Tabitha stood in the pasture a long moment, the wind moving cold across the brown grass, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite fury, but some hard, clear built out of both. This hadn't grown here in September. She was certain of it the way she was certain of her own name, the one nobody in this county had ever bothered to ask for. She had walked this exact fence line a dozen times since arriving. She would have seen it, which meant it hadn't grown here at all, which meant somebody had put it here. She ran back to the house faster than dignity strictly allowed, skirts gathered in one fist, and found Jed and Doyle both in the yard, grim-faced over another cow gone still in the grass. "I know what it is," she said, breathless. "I know how to treat it." Doyle looked at her like she'd sprouted a second head. "Ma'am, this is bad business." "Ain't the kind of thing charcoal," she said, cutting him off. "Ground fine. And the bark off any cottonwood you've got near the creek boiled down thick. It won't save the ones too far gone, but it'll stop the ones still standing from going the same way if we move now." "How do you know that?" Jed said, not doubting, just needing urgently to understand. "Because my mother taught me," Tabitha said. "Because I've seen this plant kill a goat in a single night, once, on land 300 miles from here, and I've seen what pulls an animal back from it too. Because I don't have time to explain the whole of it standing in this yard while your herd dies in front of us." Jed looked at her one long second. Then he turned to Doyle. "Do what she says." They worked through the night. All of them, Jed, Doyle, Silas, Jonah Boone, and Tabitha moving between them like the center of some grim, exhausted wheel. Directing, correcting, kneeling in the cold mud beside animals too weak to fight the treatment, even as it saved them. Boone held a lantern steady for hours without complaint, jaw set, refusing every offer to spell him. "You don't have to do that all night," Jonah told him, somewhere past midnight, voice gone rough with exhaustion. "Somebody has to," Boone said. "Might as well be me." He did not say the rest of it. Did not have to. Tabitha, passing close by with a bucket of charcoal paste, understood well enough what a boy who'd already lost one thing to sickness might feel, watching another kind of family stand a chance of going the same way. Silas mixed the charcoal paste with hands that shook from cold and fear both, and did not once say a word about either. Twice Tabitha caught him pausing over a fallen animal a beat too long, murmuring something too low to hear, and understood, without needing to ask, that this was a man who'd buried more than cattle before, and had learned not to let himself feel any of it fully until the work itself was done. Jonah, usually the one to fill silence with easy talk, said almost nothing at all that night, which was its own kind of testimony. Once, near 2 a.m, he looked up at Tabitha across a struggling calf and asked, quiet, almost afraid of the answer, "We gonna lose the whole herd, ma'am?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," Tabitha said. It wasn't a promise. She knew better than to make promises to grief before grief had finished deciding what it wanted to take, but it was enough, in that cold field at 2 a.m, to put something steadier back into Jonah's hands. By the gray edge of dawn, 11 cows stood shaky but breathing in the north pasture. 4 had not made it. 4 was a loss. 11 was, everyone standing in that field understood without saying, so something close to a miracle. They stood together a moment in the pale light, all of them mud-streaked and hollow-eyed, and nobody said much of anything, because there wasn't much left in any of them to say. Doyle took his hat off, held it a moment over his chest, the way a man does for something that deserves marking even when there's no funeral to hold. Then he put it back on, cleared his throat, and told the men to go get some sleep before the sun finished the job the night hadn't. Jed found Tabitha near the fence afterward, exhausted, mud to her elbows, hair come loose from its pins in a way she was too tired to fix. "You saved this herd," he said. "I saved part of it," she said. "I couldn't save all of it." Some part of her, raw with exhaustion, wanted to argue the point further, wanted to list every animal she hadn't reached in time. She stopped herself. Some grief doesn't want arguing with. It only wants acknowledging. Jed didn't argue either. He just looked at her, really looked, the way he'd looked at her once before, out at the pasture fence in the dark, the night he'd told her his mother would have liked her, and said, quiet, rough with exhaustion and something else besides, "I don't know what I'd have done without you out here." Tabitha didn't have an answer ready for that. For once, arithmetic failed her entirely. She only nodded and let her shoulder rest, for one brief unguarded moment, against his. Neither of them moved away as fast as either might have expected to, a month earlier. The town, when word of the sick herd reached it, did not receive the story kindly anyway. The truth, a mysterious poison, a wife's quick knowledge, a herd mostly saved, arrived in Prescott the way truth usually did in a town that size. Late, diminished, competing against a louder, uglier version that had somehow gotten there first. By the time Tabitha rode in with Doyle for supplies the following week, the version circulating through the mercantile bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened. She poisoned her own husband's herd, one woman was saying near the flour barrels, not troubling to lower her voice, because how else would a stranger know exactly what to do about it, unless she'd known exactly what she was dealing with from the start. Tabitha stood very still at the counter. She did not turn around. She did not need to see the faces to know what was on them. She had worn versions of that same face herself, once standing in rooms where people decided things about her worth, without troubling to ask her opinion of the matter. Doyle, beside her, went rigid with a fury Tabitha hadn't seen in him before. "That's a filthy lie, and you know it," he said, loud enough to carry. The woman by the flour barrels went pink, then defensive, then quiet, though quiet did not mean convinced. It never did in Tabitha's experience. It only meant the argument had moved somewhere less public, somewhere it would keep growing unseen the way rot grows best in the dark. She found Prudence Whitfield waiting outside by the buggy, as if the whole encounter had been timed. Perhaps it had. "Mrs. Colton," Prudence said, smile already arranged. "Such troubling business out at your place. I do hope the poor animals didn't suffer too dreadfully." "Some did," Tabitha said. "Most didn't. Thanks to knowledge I happen to have." "How fortunate," Prudence said, that you happened to have it. It wasn't fortune, Tabitha said. It was my mother's teaching. The same teaching some in this town seemed determined to call suspicious rather than simply useful. Prudence's smile did not move, though something behind her eyes went very still, the way water goes still right before it turns to ice. I only repeat what I hear, Mrs. Colton. I don't invent it. Somebody invented it, Tabitha said. I'd be curious to know who first thought to plant the notion, seeing as the shrub itself was planted just as deliberately. For the first time since Tabitha had met her, Prudence Whitfield's composure slipped by a fraction, small, quickly recovered, but real. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, she said. I'm sure you don't, Tabitha said, and turned to climb back into the wagon before either of them could say anything further worth regretting. Doyle, driving them home, glanced sideways at her a long while before speaking. That was a fine bit of nerve back there, ma'am, he said. It wasn't nerve, Tabitha said, watching down Shrink's small behind them. It was arithmetic. She flinched, just barely, without meaning to, she said. When I mentioned the shrub being planted, a woman with nothing to hide doesn't flinch at nothing. Doyle was quiet a moment. No, he agreed, she doesn't. Prudence Whitfield's hand was in it. Tabitha did not need proof beyond that to know it. She only needed to recognize the particular shape of the cruelty patient, precise, delivered with a smile, to know exactly whose garden this poison had been planted in. It was Boone, of all of them, who first stood up publicly against the gossip, and he did it in a way none of them expected. He'd ridden into town alone that same week for a part the wagon needed, and had stopped, against his usual habit, at the saloon for a meal before the ride back. Two older ranch hands from another outfit were talking loud at the next table, repeating the same poisoned herd story Tabitha had already heard once at the Mercantile, embellishing it further with every retelling the way stories do when nobody troubles to check them against the truth. Boone set down his fork. That ain't what happened, he said, loud enough that both men turned. And who are you, boy? One of them said, not unkindly, just careless. The way grown men are careless with boys they don't expect to talk back. I'm the one who held the lantern all night while Mrs. Colton saved 11 head of cattle that would have died without her, Boone said. I watched her hands the whole time. I never once saw anything but a woman working herself half to death to keep something alive. You want to keep telling it different, you go on. But you tell it different in front of me again. You tell it knowing I was there and you weren't. The saloon had gone quiet around them. The older man studied Boone a long moment, then looked away first, muttering something about no offense, and Boone, 17 years old and still growing into his own boots, picked his fork back up and finished his meal in a silence that shifted, somehow, entirely in his favor. He told Tabitha about it that evening, awkward, half apologetic, as if defending her might have overstepped some line he wasn't certain of. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, Boone said. Didn't feel like a choice, though. Felt like just telling the truth. Tabitha didn't trust her voice to answer that properly, so she only nodded and set an extra spoonful of stew on his plate that night without either of them remarking on it. Some kindnesses, she understood by now, were better left unspoken. Simply passed forward, quietly the way they'd been given. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Tabitha sat at the small table by her window and wrote to her mother by lamplight, the way she did most weeks now, though the letters traveled slow and uncertain through the agency's careful gates, and she never knew for certain which ones arrived. Mother, she wrote, the herd sickened, and I healed most of what could be healed, and I have come to understand, in the doing of it, that the knowledge you gave me is worth more out here than I ever imagined it could be back home, where everyone already knew it and nobody needed telling. She paused, chewed the end of her pen, started again. There is a banker here who means us harm. I won't pretend otherwise. Not to you, not in a letter. Because you raised me on honesty, and I don't intend to abandon it now, for the sake of sparing your worry. He has poisoned cattle. He has sent lawyers. He means to prove my marriage is a lie, built only of arithmetic, so that he might take what the marriage was meant to protect. I am not afraid of him the way I thought I would be. He sat with that sentence a long moment, testing whether it was entirely true. It was, she decided, mostly. I am afraid of losing what I have built here before I have finished building it, she wrote instead, which felt closer to honest. A kitchen. A husband who is slowly becoming someone I did not expect to want, though I find I do want him, more than the arithmetic of this arrangement ever required me to. A boy who stood up for me in a saloon full of strangers because he decided the truth mattered more than his own comfort. A foreman carrying an old grief I have not yet decided what to do with, though I find myself, against my own caution, hoping he goes on trying. You told me I have never been a small person. I am trying every day to prove you right. Some days it is easier than others. This has not been an easy week. I love you. I think of you every morning while the bread rises, because you are the reason I know how to make it rise at all. Your daughter. She folded the letter carefully, sealed it, and set it on the small table to be carried into town with the next supply run. And then she sat a long while longer in the lamplight, missing her mother with a sharpness that had not dulled in 3 months of distance, only changed shape, the way grief and longing both eventually do. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear Jed's boots, restless, pacing the kitchen floor the way they still did some nights, though these nights, she had noticed, he paced less like a man running from something and more like a man working up the courage to walk toward it instead. She did not go to him, not yet. But she left her door, for the first time since arriving on this ranch, very slightly ajar. She found the second patch of the shrub some days later. She hadn't gone looking for it, not exactly. She'd gone out walking the far boundary line, the one that ran along the edge of Colton land before it gave way, without much ceremony, to Whitfield property beyond, because walking had become the only thing that quieted her mind since the herd sickened, and because some restless, careful part of her had refused to stop cataloging the land since that first terrible morning. She found it growing in a tidy row, not scattered the way nature scatters things, careless and uneven. A row planted, deliberate, close enough to the fence line for us, pushing through a gap in old wire the way cattle always eventually did, would find it without any trouble at all. Tabitha crouched beside it a long time, feeling something cold and certain settle into her chest, because a plant doesn't grow in a row on its own, because nature doesn't plant in straight lines, not ever, not once in all her years of walking this earth and reading its alphabet, which meant someone with reason enough and patience enough and cruelty enough to poison an entire herd rather than simply wait for a note to come due honestly. She thought of a banker's careful smile, of a wife's careful visits, of a letter that had somehow reached Prudence Whitfield's ears before Tabitha had told a soul in Prescott the details of her own marriage. She did not have proof yet, not proof a judge would weigh, but she had certainty. And certainty, she reminded herself, walking the long road back toward the house, with the cold autumn light going thin and gold behind her. Certainty was where every fight worth winning eventually had to start. She told Doyle first, not Jed, not yet. She needed, before she carried this into her husband's house and his temper both, to understand exactly how deep the danger ran. Doyle listened, jaw working, saying nothing until she'd finished. Then he said something that stopped her cold. I know men like that, he said. Patient men. Men who'll spend a whole year setting up one clean shot rather than take 10 messy ones. How do you know that? Tabitha asked. Doyle didn't answer right away. Because I used to be paid to think the same way, he said finally. Different war. Different reasons, but the same patience, the same willingness to hurt something slow if it got you what you wanted quicker in the end. Tabitha's hands went still on the leather cinch strap. What war, she said, though some cold, certain part of her already suspected the answer before he gave it. Doyle met her eyes, didn't look away, though it plainly cost him something to hold still under the weight of it. I scouted for the army, he said, years back. Before I ever came to work this outfit. Against your people, ma'am, I won't dress it up prettier than it was. I rode against the very folks you come from, and I did it because I was told it was my duty. And I believed that, at the time, the way a young fool believes most things he's told, with enough conviction. He looked away, then, out toward the fence line, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone somewhere else. Somewhere further back. I remember a canyon, he said, wintertime, cold enough to crack stone. We came up on a camp before dawn, and I remember thinking, even then, even young and fool enough to believe in the whole business, I remember thinking it didn't look like the enemy the recruiting posters described. Looked like families, looked like people trying to keep warm. He stopped, started again, quieter. I did my job that morning anyway. Told myself it was duty. Told myself a lot of things those years that let me keep doing what I was doing without having to feel the whole weight of it at once. Doesn't excuse it. Not then, not now, but I stopped believing those things a long while back, and I've spent every year since trying to be a different kind of man than the one that walked out of that canyon." The yard between them went silent. Tabitha felt something in her chest go cold and sharp all at once, betrayal, or the beginning shape of it, tangled up with something else she didn't yet have a name for. "You've known this whole time," she said, "who I was, what your own hands had done to people like mine. And you said nothing." "I said nothing, because I was ashamed," Doyle said, "because there ain't a version of that sentence that comes out sounding like anything but what it is. I've spent years trying to be a different kind of man than the one I was in those years. I don't know as I've earned the right to say I've succeeded. I only know I've tried." "Trying isn't the same as making it right," Tabitha said. "No," Doyle agreed, quiet. "It isn't." "I don't know what to do with this," Tabitha said. "I don't know how to stand in a kitchen with a man and hand him coffee every morning, knowing what his hands once did to people who looked like my father, my mother." "I don't expect you to know right off," Doyle said. "I wouldn't trust you if you did. Grief like that don't get sorted out standing in a yard on a bad afternoon. Takes longer than that. Takes as long as it takes." She turned and walked away from him then, out toward the fence line, needing distance more than she needed an answer, and Doyle did not follow her. He only stood there, in the yard, an old soldier carrying an old war he could not set down no matter how many years he'd spent trying, and watched her go. She did not tell Jed that night either. She sat instead at the small table in her room, the lamp burning low. Her mother's recipe box open in front of her, though. She wasn't looking at any of the cards inside it, and she let herself, for the first time since arriving on this ranch, feel the full weight of everything she'd been carrying. A husband she was only beginning to trust. A foreman whose past sat now like a stone lodged somewhere behind her ribs. A banker's wife weaving lies through a town that had never once asked Tabitha a fair question about who she actually was. And underneath all of it, quiet, patient, waiting the man in the corner office with 2 sunlit windows, who had, she now understood with total certainty, poisoned a herd of cattle rather than wait honestly for a debt to come due. She thought of her mother's voice. "You have never been a small person." She thought, too, of something else her mother used to say on the harder nights, when the rations were late and the fire was low, and the whole world seemed built specifically to grind a person down to nothing. "A debt like that don't get settled with money. Only with the same kind of kindness, paid forward when the moment comes round to pay it." Except this wasn't kindness she was owed now. This was harm. Deliberate, patient, planted in a row harm. And harm, she thought, sitting alone in the lamplight with her jaw set and her spine straight, harm had its own kind of debt, too. One she intended in time to see paid in full. She found Doyle 3 mornings later, alone at the corral, mending a section of rail that didn't strictly need mending. "I'm not ready to forgive it," she said without preamble. "I want you to know that plainly, the way you were plain with me. I wouldn't ask you to be ready before you are," Doyle said, not looking up from his work. "But I watched you hold that lantern all night for a boy who needed his hands free," she went on. "And I watched you take your hat off for 4 dead animals, like they deserved mourning. A man who did what you did once, and stopped, and spent years since trying to be someone else entirely. That man and the one in the canyon aren't the same man wearing the same skin forever. I know that. My mother taught me people can be more than the worst thing they've done. She taught me that mercy without proof is foolishness. But mercy earned slowly, through years of trying, that's a different thing." "I'm not asking for mercy," Doyle said. "Good," Tabitha said. "Because I'm not offering it yet. I'm only telling you I haven't decided to hate you for it either. That's the whole of where I am today. Might be further along tomorrow. Might not." Doyle nodded slow, and went back to the rail he didn't need to mend, and something in the set of his shoulders, watching him, told Tabitha he understood exactly how much of a gift that small, unfinished honesty actually was. Jed found her on the porch that same evening, the sky gone the deep violet of early winter, stars just beginning to prick through. "You've had a hard week," he said, settling beside her on the step. "I've had a hard several weeks," Tabitha said. Jed was quiet a moment, turning his hat over in his hands, the same slow way he had outside the courthouse, months back, though the gesture meant something different now than it had then. "I keep thinking," he said finally, "about how little I knew you, going into this. Your name. Your people. What you'd survived before you ever answered my mother's letter. I married a stranger because a will demanded it, and somewhere along the way I stopped noticing when she quit being a stranger." "When did that happen?" Tabitha asked. "For you, I mean." Jed considered the question with the same careful weight he gave everything. "Might have been the biscuits," he said. Might have been the mended hinge, might have been watching you walk into a poisoned pasture at first light without waiting to be asked twice. He shook his head. I couldn't tell you the exact morning. I only know it happened, and I know I'm glad of it, whatever Whitfield's lawyers want to call it in front of a judge. Tabitha looked at him a long moment in the fading light. That's the truest thing you've said to me since the courthouse, she said. I've got a few more where that came from, Jed said, given time. I'd like that, Tabitha said, and meant it, entirely, the way she had not quite let herself mean things in a very long while. The papers arrived the following week, carried out by a rider. Tabitha didn't recognize, delivered into Jed's hands with the particular cold formality of a man paid to deliver bad news and not much interested in softening it. Jed read the first page standing in the yard, then the second. His face by the third had gone the color of old ash. What is it? Tabitha asked, though some part of her had already begun to guess, the way a body braces for a blow it can see coming but cannot yet name. Jed handed her the papers without a word. She read them fast, the way she read everything that mattered, cold, clear, cataloging each cruelty in turn. A legal challenge. Trial filed on behalf of the estate's creditors, which was to say, filed by Bennett Whitfield's own lawyers, though his name did not appear directly anywhere on the document, the way a careful man's name never appeared directly on the things he built to hurt other people. The challenge argued that the marriage between J.D. Colton and the woman known as Tabitha, formerly of the San Carlos agency, had been entered into hastily for reasons of financial convenience alone, absent any genuine intention of a lasting union, and ought therefore to be examined by the court before being recognized as satisfying the terms of the late Josiah Colton's will. A hearing had been requested before Judge Holcomb within the month. Tabitha set the papers down on the porch rail. Her hands did not shake. She would not let them. They mean to prove we don't love each other, she said. Jed's hands, when she looked up, were shaking not with fear, she understood, but with a fury too large for his body to hold entirely still around. Then we'll prove them wrong, he said. Doyle arrived in the yard midway through, took one look at both their faces, and read the papers himself without being asked. His expression, by the end, had gone the same hard, flat color Tabitha had come to recognize as his particular brand of anger, quieter than shouting, and worse for it. This is a coward's move, he said. Man's too much of a snake to come at you honest, so he's sending lawyers to do his slithering for him. It's a clever move, Tabitha said. That's what frightens me more than the cowardice of it. He isn't wrong that this marriage began as arithmetic. A roof, a purpose, a will's provision. If a judge only hears the beginning of the story, he might well believe there's nothing more to it. Then we make sure he hears the whole story, Doyle said. Every hand on this ranch will stand up and say what they've watched happen in that kitchen these past months, if it comes to it. Ain't a man among us who couldn't testify to what we've seen change in this house since you came to it. In front of the whole county, Tabitha said. In a courtroom, with Whitfield sitting there, smiling the whole time. Let him smile, Jed said. Man like that's never once had to prove a single true thing about himself in his whole life. He won't know what it looks like when we do. The next morning, before Tabitha had even finished laying out breakfast, she found all four hands already gathered at the table, uncharacteristically early, uncharacteristically quiet. Doyle spoke first, the way he generally did when something needed saying plainly. We heard about the papers, he said. Whole bunkhouse heard by supper last night. Wanted you both to know where we stand on it, plain, before this goes any further. Silas nodded once, jaw set. Jonah, for once entirely without his usual easy humor, said simply, whatever Whitfield's lawyers want to call this marriage, we know what we've watched happen in this kitchen. Ain't a court in the territory gonna tell me different from what my own eyes have seen. Boone didn't say anything at all. He only looked at Tabitha, steady, the same steady look he'd worn the night he held that lantern for hours without complaint. And something in his face said more plainly than words ever could, where his loyalty had settled. Tabitha set down the coffee pot, feeling something rise in her throat she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely prepared to manage gracefully. Thank you, she managed finally. All of you. Ain't nothing to thank us for, Doyle said. Just telling the truth, same as you'll do when the time comes. Jed, watching from the head of the table, said nothing for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way none of them had heard from him before. My mother built a fine outfit here, he said, but I don't think even she'd have guessed it'd turn in Willington to stand up in a courtroom for a woman she never lived to meet. She'd have loved her anyway, Doyle said quiet, same as the rest of us have. Nobody said anything else for a while after that. Nobody needed to. The biscuits, when Tabitha finally set them on the table, were eaten in the same particular silence that had greeted them the very first morning, months back. Not the silence of doubt this time, but something entirely its opposite. The silence of a table full of people who had already decided, long before any judge would get the chance to ask them, exactly what they believed to be true. Tabitha looked at her husband, this quiet, careful, grieving man who had, in so short a time, become something she had not let herself name out loud even now. Even standing in the wreckage of a legal threat aimed squarely at the heart of everything they'd built and felt. Underneath the fear, something else entirely. Something that was not quite arithmetic anymore. Something closer, if she let herself be honest about it, to hope. "We have a month," she said. "We do," Jed said. "Then we'd best use it," Tabitha said, "because a courtroom isn't the only place a lie like this gets answered. Sometimes the surer place is a table, a dish, a whole county sitting down together and tasting the truth for themselves before anyone in a black robe ever says a word." "The autumn social," Jed said, understanding. "The autumn social," Tabitha agreed. Behind them, up on the rise, the wind moved through the dry grass over Adelaide Colton's grave, the same way it always did, patient, indifferent, carrying no answers of its own. But for the first time in weeks, standing there with her husband in the last gold light of a dangerous autumn, Tabitha did not feel like a woman waiting helplessly for a storm to arrive. She felt instead like a woman already halfway through building the roof that would survive it. Before the papers ever arrived, though 3 days after the herd sickened, while the whole ranch still smelled faintly of smoke and charcoal paste, Jed had ridden into town to see a lawyer of his own, a man named Garrett Pruitt, young, sharp-eyed, new enough to Prescott that Whitfield's influence hadn't yet had time to reach every corner of his practice. Whitfield's clever, Pruitt told him, across a desk, considerably less tidy than the one in the corner office with 2 sunlit windows. But cleverness has a weakness. It always wants an audience it can control. That's why he'll push for a hearing before Judge Holcomb specifically, if he pushes for a hearing at all. "Why Holcomb?" Jed asked. "Because Holcomb's fair," Pruitt said. "Scrupulously so. Whitfield can't buy him, and he knows it. But fair means Holcomb will want to see the marriage plainly, on its own honest terms, not argued about in the abstract. He won't take Whitfield's word for what a marriage is or isn't. He'll want to see it for himself." Jed had turned that over a long while, riding home in the fading light. He'd thought of Tabitha, kneeling in the mud beside a dying calf at 2 in the morning, giving orders nobody in that yard had any inclination to argue with. He'd thought of a plate covered on the stove, of flour dusted across a cheekbone he could not stop noticing, of a woman who had walked into a poisoned pasture at dawn without waiting to be asked twice. If Holcomb wanted to see the marriage plainly, Jed thought, then let him see it plainly. He wasn't afraid of that anymore. He was only afraid of running out of time before anyone else got the chance to. The days that followed took on a new shape. Preparation mostly, though it wore the disguise of ordinary ranch work, mending, cleaning, the slow accumulation of small tasks that all pointed quietly toward the same distant date circled now in Jed's ledger and Tabitha's memory both. She spent 3 evenings deciding what she would bring to the social and found the deciding harder than she'd expected. She could make what the county expected. Honey bread. A pie crust flake thin the way her own mother's teacher, decades back, had once been taught by a mission woman eager to see old ways replaced by new ones. Safe. Familiar. Nothing a suspicious eye could call foreign. Or she could make what she actually knew best. She sat with the question a long while, the lamp burning low, her mother's recipe box open in front of her, cards worn soft under her fingers. Jed found her there past midnight and did not ask she was still awake. He had learned, by now, to recognize the particular stillness of a mind working through something too large to say out loud right away. "What is it?" he asked anyway, softer than usual. "I don't know what to bring," Tabitha said. "To the social. I don't know whether to bring what will make them comfortable, or what will make them see me." Jed sat across from her, quiet a moment, turning the question over with the same careful weight he gave most things that mattered. "Which one matters more to you?" he asked finally. Tabitha considered that. Considered the 8 years of careful smallness that had gotten her this far, the 8 years of choosing comfort over truth, because comfort, more often than not, was the safer road for a woman with nothing else to fall back on. "I'm tired of choosing comfort," she said. "I think I have been for a while without letting myself notice it." "Then don't," Jed said. "Bring what you know. Bring what your mother taught you. If Prescott can't stomach the truth of who my wife is, that's a failing in Prescott, not in you. I'd rather stand in that hall beside the real thing than beside some careful performance of it. Tabitha looked at him a long moment, something in her chest loosening the way it had loosened once before, over a mended hinge, over a covered plate, over half a slice of dried apple pie eaten standing at a dark counter. That's a braver answer than I expected, she said. I've had a good teacher in bravery lately, Jed said. Watched her walk into a poisoned pasture without waiting to be asked twice. Tabitha laughed soft, surprised, the sound still unfamiliar enough in her own throat that it caught her off guard every time. She decided that night what she would bring. Mesquite honey bread, made her mother's way. The sweetness folded in with flour ground by hand the way it had been ground for 3 generations before her. A pie crust that owed nothing to any mission kitchen's careful instruction. A stew built from ingredients half the county walked past every day without ever learning to see. The whole of who she was, laid out plain on a table, for anyone brave enough to taste it honestly. Let them decide, she thought, closing the recipe box at last and blowing out the lamp. Let the whole county sit down and decide, once and for all, whether the truth of her was something worth making room for. She had a feeling, closing her eyes that night in a house that had finally, entirely, stopped feeling like a stranger's, that it was 40 miles away. Bennett Whitfield read the confirmation from his lawyers that the hearing had been granted and allowed himself, once again, that same small, private smile. He had expected some resistance, a telegram perhaps pleading for delay, a visit from Colton himself, hat in hand, asking for reason where none would be given. He had not expected silence. Silence in Whitfield's long experience meant one of two things. Either a man had no fight left in him at all, or he was saving it for somewhere it would matter more. He found himself against his own careful instincts, faintly curious which one this particular silence would turn out to be. Prudence, he said, without looking up from his desk, where his wife stood arranging a fresh vase of hothouse flowers with her usual unhurried precision. I understand the Colton woman made something of a scene at the Mercantile last week. She did, Prudence said. Rather a composed one, actually. Whitfield set down his pen. Composed, he repeated. Prudence turned to face him fully, something careful in her own expression now, the kind of carefulness that came from watching an opponent longer than one's husband had bothered to. I don't think she frightens as easily as we hoped, Bennett. Whitfield considered that a long moment, turning it over the way he turned over every piece of information that arrived on his desk, weighing its usefulness against its danger. Then we'll simply have to apply more pressure than we hoped, he said finally, and returned to his letters, unhurried, patient, entirely certain that patience, applied correctly, had never once in his whole career failed to eventually get him exactly what he wanted. He was not accustomed yet to being wrong about that. He would be, before the year was through. But autumn had not finished with any of them yet, and there remained still one long and dangerous month standing between the Colton Ranch and whatever the courthouse in Prescott had waiting for them at the end of it. The church hall in Prescott was warm with lamplight the night of the autumn social, warm and loud and full of a smell that made even the most careful gossip pause mid-sentence to breathe it in. Tables ran the length of the hall, 24 dishes crowded shoulder to shoulder, and above them the low hum of a county's worth of conversation. All of it, Tabitha understood, without needing to hear the particulars, circling one way or another back to her. She felt every eye that turned toward her carry some version of the whisper that had chased her through the Mercantile for weeks now. She set her dishes down anyway, because a table doesn't lie, because bread doesn't have an agenda, because whatever these people had decided to believe about her these past months, they hadn't yet actually tasted the truth for themselves. She meant to give them the chance. Mesquite honey bread, laid out plain among 24 other offerings. A pie crust that owed nothing to any mission kitchen's careful instruction. A stew that had simmered since dawn, filling the whole hall with a smell that pulled guests toward the kitchen table before the meal was even announced. Jed stood close beside her, closer than strict custom required, his shoulder nearly brushing hers, and she understood the gesture for exactly what it was. Not performance, not for the benefit of watching eyes. Simply a man choosing plainly, publicly, where he intended to stand. Prudence Whitfield arrived on her husband's arm precisely 20 minutes later, wearing a smile fixed place like a woman certain of her ground. She was not, as it turned out, quite as certain as she looked. Bennett Whitfield surveyed the hall the way a man surveys a chessboard he believes he has already won. "Colton," he said, finding Jed near the punch table. "Fine turnout tonight." "It is," Jed said. "I trust the hearing date suits you both." Whitfield's voice was pleasant, unhurried, the particular pleasantness of a man who has never once had to raise it to get what he wanted. 3 days from now. Judge Holcomb doesn't care for delays. Neither do I, Jed said. Whitfield's eyes moved briefly toward Tabitha, still arranging dishes across the room, before returning to Jed with something almost curious behind them. I confess I'm surprised you've kept this arrangement standing so long, Whitfield said. Most men in your position would have cut their losses months ago, once it became clear how much scrutiny a hasty marriage invites. It isn't an arrangement anymore, Jed said. Hasn't been for some while now. I don't expect you to understand the difference, seeing as you married for advantage and never once looked past it. Something flickered behind Whitfield's careful eyes, not quite anger, something colder, more controlled. We'll see what Judge Holk makes of your sentiment, he said. We will, Jed said. Whitfield smiled at that, turned to go, then almost as an afterthought, glanced toward the dessert table, where Tabitha stood arranging her pie beside 24 others. Your wife cooks well, he said. I hear, Jed said. Pity, Whitfield said. So much skill wrapped around so little that will hold up under oath. He walked away before Jed could answer that. Which was, Jed understood, watching him go, exactly the point. It was Judge Holcomb's steady, plain-spoken, utterly indifferent to Prescott politics, who reached for a second helping of Tabitha's stew before he'd so much as tasted the fashionable dishes Prudence had arranged near the head of the table. Now this, he said, to no one and everyone. This is a stew a man remembers his mother making. He took a third helping, then a fourth. Prudence's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes went very still. Just Prudence, just Whitfield, just a hall full of people deciding, one bite at a time, what they actually believed. It was the bread that did the most damage to whatever careful arrangement Prudence had planned for that evening. Judge Holcomb tore off a piece, buttered it, went entirely silent for a long moment, the particular silence of a man transported somewhere else by a taste he hadn't expected to find in a church hall in Prescott. Mrs. Colton, he said finally, I have eaten in the finest hotels in 3 territories, and I will tell you plainly, I have not tasted bread like this since I was a boy on my grandmother's porch. Prudence, careful cook, standing near the kitchen doorway waiting for praise that had gone elsewhere entirely, looked as though she had swallowed something sharp. Jed, across the room, allowed himself something dangerously close to a smile. Prudence Whitfield did not take the moment gracefully. She crossed the hall directly, skirt sharp with purpose, and stopped close enough to Tabitha that the surrounding conversation dipped low, listening. You must be quite pleased with yourself, Prudence said, voice pitched just loud enough to carry, just soft enough to sound private. I'm pleased the judge enjoyed the bread, Tabitha said. Nothing more complicated than that. Isn't it? A poisoned herd. A convenient marriage. A hearing 3 days off that half this county's already placing wagers on. You've managed quite a performance for a woman who claims to want nothing but a roof. Something in Tabitha went very still, because she had heard versions of this voice before. In a mercantile, in a courthouse clerk's board dismissal, in 8 long years of rooms where people decided her worth without asking her opinion of the matter. Except this time she was not 17, wringing out a cloth for a stranger's frostbitten feet. This time she was not standing at a gate waiting for permission to leave. I have never performed a single thing since I arrived in this county, Tabitha said, plain, unhurried, the same voice she'd used the first morning over the biscuits. I have cooked. I have healed a herd with knowledge your own cook couldn't begin to name. I have written my mother the truth every week, including the truth of what your husband has done. Whatever performance is happening here tonight, Mrs. Whitfield, I'd look considerably closer to home before you go accusing anyone else of putting one on. The hall had gone quieter than either of them had intended it to. Prudence's smile, for the first time since Tabitha had known her, did not hold. She turned, walked away, and did not return to that side of the hall again for the rest of the evening. Judge Holcomb, who had watched the entire exchange with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything, caught Tabitha's eye across the room and gave the smallest, most deliberate nod. It was, Tabitha understood, not nothing. That was when Doyle arrived, late, dust still on his coat, a leather satchel clutched under one arm like something he did not entirely trust to carry itself steady. He found Tabitha first. Ma'am, he said low, I need you to see something, and I need Jed and the judge both to see it after. What is it? Tabitha said, though something in his face had already told her it mattered more than she wanted it to. Doyle opened the satchel. Inside was a torn scrap of feed sack, Stiff with age, a brand burned into one corner that Tabitha recognized instantly from every fence post along the Whitfield property line. And this, Doyle said, drawing out a second item. Boot cast. Plaster. Took it myself 3 days back, from a print set deep in soft ground, not 10 feet from where that poison shrub was planted in a row along our fence. Whose boot? Tabitha asked, though she already suspected. Cole Weaver's, Doyle said. Rides for Whitfield. I tracked men for a living once, ma'am. Different reasons. Worse reasons. But I still know a print when I see one, and I know Weaver's particular gait favors his right heel, on account of an old injury same as I'd know my own. Tabitha stared at the evidence a long moment. You went back out there, she said. Alone. Tracking. Because somebody had to, Doyle said. Because I owed this family a debt I couldn't pay with words alone. Because tracking is the one skill from my old life I never wanted to keep, and I figured if it was going to stay lodged in my hands anyway, it might as well finally be put to some honest use. I searched for 2 days before I found anything worth bringing. Back, he went on, quieter now. Walked that fence line so many times I near wore a path in it myself. Kept thinking about that canyon. Kept thinking, if I could have tracked one thing right in this life, one single thing worth the tracking, let it be this. Let it be something that saves a family instead of ending one. Something in Tabitha's chest, hearing that, loosened in a way she hadn't expected it to. Not yet. Not this soon. Thank you, she said. It wasn't forgiveness. Not entirely. But it was closer to it than either of them had stood before. Don't thank me till we see what a judge makes of it, Doyle said, though something in his weathered face had eased considerably. Hearing her say it anyway, Doyle brought the satchel to Jed and Judge Holcomb both, in a quiet corner of the hall, away from the music and the noise, and laid the evidence out plain. Holcomb studied the boot cast a long moment, then the feed sack, his expression giving away nothing. This is compelling, he said finally. Not conclusive, but compelling enough to warrant questioning at the hearing. Bennett Whitfield will deny all of it, Jed said. He will, Holcomb agreed. Which is precisely why we have hearings. Let him deny it in front of witnesses under oath and let the county watch him do it. Across the hall, Whitfield had gone very still, watching the small, huddled conversation with an expression that had, for the first time since Tabitha had met him, lost some measure of its careful pleasantness. He did not yet know what they held. He would know soon enough. Tabitha did not sleep the night before the hearing. She lay awake instead, staring at a ceiling she knew well now, in a house that had long since stopped feeling borrowed, and let her mind run the way it hadn't let itself run in months. What if the boot cast wasn't enough? What if Weaver held his tongue after all, out of fear of Whitfield worse than fear of the law? What if Holcomb, for all his fairness, simply couldn't see past the plain bare fact of how the marriage had begun? A letter, an arrangement, a will's deadline bearing down like weather nobody could outrun. Because that was the trouble with truth, wasn't it? It didn't always arrive loud enough to be heard over a louder, uglier story that had gotten there first. She thought of her mother's voice. You have never been a small person. She thought of Jed's voice, rougher lately, warmer, saying things across a kitchen table he wouldn't have dared say 4 months back. Except what if none of it mattered tomorrow? What if a room full of strangers in black robes and county hats decided, in the space of an afternoon, that everything she'd built here the herd saved, the bread that made a judge go quiet with memory, a husband who had stopped pushing food around his plate, none of it counted as proof of anything real at all? She sat up, lit the lamp, pulled her mother's recipe box toward her, the way she always did when her mind wouldn't settle, running her thumb along the worn edges of the cards. Down the hall she heard Jed's boots, restless, awake too, apparently, on this of all nights. She found him in the kitchen a few minutes later, standing at the window, staring out at nothing in particular. Couldn't sleep either, he said. Not a question, no, she said. They stood together a while in the dark kitchen, not touching, not needing to, two people bracing for the same storm from the same side of it. Whatever happens tomorrow, Jed said finally. I meant every word I planned to say in that courtroom. Whatever Holcomb decides about the paper, I already decided the rest of it myself a good while back. Tabitha felt something in her chest steady, just slightly, enough to let her breathe. Then let tomorrow be tomorrow, she said. Tonight, at least, we already know the truth of it. They stood at that window a long while longer, watching the last of the night burn slowly down toward whatever the morning intended to bring them. The hearing was held 3 days later in the same Prescott courthouse where Jed and Tabitha had said their vows, the same clerk's ledger open on the same worn desk, though this time the room was crowded with more people than Tabitha had ever seen. Inside it, half the county, drawn by curiosity or loyalty or simple appetite for a story too good to miss. Judge Holcomb sat at the bench unhurried and let Whitfield's lawyer speak first. The lawyer painted the marriage exactly as Tabitha had feared he would. Hasty, convenient, a woman with nothing and a man with a will's deadline bearing down on him, and no evidence of affection beyond what either party might now claim. Conveniently, after the fact, once a courtroom made claiming it useful. It was, the lawyer argued, precisely the kind of arrangement the law existed to see through. Whitfield, seated beside his lawyer, wore his usual careful composure, though Tabitha noticed, watching him closely, that his hands stayed folded a little too tightly on the table before him. A small thing. But she had learned, months back, watching him flinch at nothing across his wife's careful smile, that small things were often the only threads worth pulling. Then Doyle was called. He testified plain about the boot cast, the feed sack, the particular gait of a man named Cole Weaver, tracked back from a row of poison planted with deliberate, patient cruelty along the Colton fence line. And how would a foreman know one man's gait from another's? With Whitfield's lawyer asked, skeptical, on cross. Because I spent years of my life reading Ground for a Lift, Doyle said. Ground don't lie, sir. Neither does a man's own 2 feet, once you know how to ask them what they've been doing. A ripple of low murmurs moved through the courtroom. Weaver himself, seated near the back under the sheriff's watch, would not meet anyone's eyes. When his name was called, he rose slowly, hat crushed in both hands, and stood before the bench like a man already halfway to confessing before a single question had been asked. Mr. Weaver, Holcomb said, did you plant that shrub? The silence stretched. Yes, sir, Weaver said finally, voice cracking. Whitfield paid me. Told me it had forced the Colton note due early was all. Didn't tell me he stopped. Swallowed hard. Didn't tell me he'd near kill a whole herd of cattle. I didn't sign on for that. I didn't sign on for none of it, if I'm honest, but I took the money anyway, and I'll answer for that. Whitfield's lawyer half rose, objecting, but the damage had already settled over the courtroom like dust that would not be swept back up again. Bennett Whitfield's careful composure, for the first time in his entire calculated life, began visibly, publicly to crack. You'll answer for a great deal more than that. Whitfield, Holcomb said, not unkind, simply factual, before instructing the clerk to note Weaver's confession for the territorial prosecutor's attention. Then Judge Holcomb asked Jedediah Colton to stand. Tell me plainly, Mr. Colton, he said. Why did you marry this woman? Jed rose. Looked for one long moment, not at the judge, but at Tabitha, seated beside her lawyer with her spine straight, and her hands folded the same careful way they had been folded in this very room, months back, on the day they'd become strangers wearing the same name. I married her because my mother asked me to, Jed said. That's the truth, and I won't pretend otherwise in front of this court. The room shifted, a murmur moving through it. But that isn't why I stayed married to her, Jed went on. I stayed because she rebuilt a kitchen nobody else had the patience to save. Because she walked into a poisoned pasture at dawn without waiting to be asked twice, and saved 11 head of cattle with knowledge. Half this county dismissed before they ever troubled to ask what she knew. Because, she writes her mother every week, in a hand steadier than my own, telling the truth even when the truth is hard to write. Because I have watched this woman earn the respect of every hand on my ranch, one honest act at a time, in a county that gave her nothing and asked everything. His voice, by the end, had gone rough. I don't know the exact morning I stopped thinking of her as an arrangement, he said. I only know I did. And I know that, whatever this court decides about the paper we signed, I intend to spend the rest of my life married to her regardless. Will or no will, water rights or none. The courtroom had gone entirely silent. Tabitha, sitting very still, felt something break open in her chest that she had spent 8 careful years keeping shut. She did not cry. She had promised herself once that she would not cry in front of walls that couldn't be trusted to keep a secret. But this wall, she thought, blinking hard, this particular room, full of these particular witnesses, this one perhaps, could be trusted after all. Judge Holcomb took the rest of the afternoon to decide, though everyone in that courtroom understood, long before he returned, which way the decision would fall. He found the marriage valid. genuine in fact and in spirit both, and entitled to every provision the late Josiah Colton's will had intended. He found Bennett Whitfield criminally liable for the poisoning of the Colton herd, on evidence corroborated by Cole Weaver's own sworn testimony, and referred the matter, along with several other troubling irregularities Weaver had been persuaded to mention regarding certain other notes Whitfield held across the county, to the territorial prosecutor for further investigation. And he ordered, as part of the settlement, that the water rights on the north section, the section that fed 3 other ranches downstream, not just the Coltons, be shared under a fair and binding agreement among all the ranches that depended on it, rather than concentrated in the hands of whoever happened to hold the note. It was, Holcomb said, closing the proceedings, precisely the kind of arrangement Josiah Colton's provision had likely intended all along, whether he'd known it plainly at the time or not. A debt of water paid forward to everyone who needed it, not hoarded by whoever could afford to buy the paper. The courtroom erupted, quiet at first, then not so quiet neighboring ranchers who'd spent years watching that North Spring run low every August, wondering privately whether Whitfield's bank might someday squeeze the flow tighter still, suddenly finding themselves with water rights secured for the first time in a generation. One old rancher, a man named Abernathy who'd worked land 2 sections over since before Jed was born, made his way through the crowd afterward to shake Tabitha's hand directly. Something Tabitha understood, watching his weathered face, had cost him some old and careful prejudice to do. "Ma'am," he said, "whatever this county's been saying about you these past months, I reckon we owe you an apology instead. My herd drinks off that same spring, has for 30 years. I didn't know how close I came to losing it till today." "You don't owe me anything," Tabitha said. "I reckon I do," Abernathy said. "Owing and repaying being 2 different things, and I intend to see the second one through in my own time." Bennett Whitfield left the courthouse that afternoon, a smaller man than he had entered it, his careful composure gone entirely. His corner office and its 2 sunlit windows soon to belong, the territorial paper would report within the month, to a bank examiner sent from the capital to sort through considerably more than one poisoned herd. Prudence Whitfield did not stay in Prescott long after that. Nobody, in the years that followed, spent much time thinking about either of them again. Judge Holcomb found Tabitha outside the courthouse. Afterward, the crowd thinning around them, winter light going long and gold across the street. "Mrs. Colton," he said, "I've sat this bench 11 years, heard every manner of arrangement a person can call a marriage. Most of them, if I'm honest, don't hold up half as well as yours did today." "Thank you, Judge," Tabitha said. "Wasn't the bread that convinced me, if that's what you're wondering," Holcomb said, something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Though I'll admit it didn't hurt your case any. It was watching your husband's face while he testified. Man doesn't get that particular kind of rough in his voice over an arrangement, only over the truth." He tipped his hat then, formal, unhurried, and turned to go, leaving Tabitha standing a long moment on the courthouse steps, feeling something settle into place inside her that had been unsettled for the better part of a year. The ranch settled slowly into a new ordinary after that, the kind of ordinary that only looks unremarkable from the outside. The men still teased each other over supper, and still fought over the last of anything Tabitha baked. Boone, who had stood up for her once in a saloon full of strangers, took to sitting closest to her at the table most evenings, a quiet, unspoken loyalty that needed no further explanation. He ate, these days, out of habit and belonging both, rather than the old hollow hunger that had once driven every meal. Silas fixed things without being asked, same as ever, though these days he'd taken to sitting a while afterward, too, on the porch step he'd mended, talking easy with Jonah about nothing much at all, the particular ease of men who trust the ground they're standing on. Jonah still teased her about tricks and biscuits, though the teasing had long since become its own kind of affection, worn soft and familiar as a well-used recipe card. Doyle took to calling her Mrs. Colton with a warmth that had nothing left of his old caution in it, and once, in an unguarded moment near the corral, told her flatly that she'd fixed more than a kitchen when she came to that ranch. She'd fixed something in all of them that had gone quiet since Jed's mother passed, and the whole crew was grateful for it, in their own rough way, though none of them would ever say so plain twice. Tabitha's recipe box, battered and held together with string, found a permanent home on the kitchen shelf, its cards worn soft at the edges from daily use. Each one a small monument to a mother who had lived, after all, to see her daughter finally land somewhere she was wanted, rather than merely needed. Winter came on hard that year, the way it always did in cattle country, snow drifting waist-deep against the barn, and it was in that long, close season that something else, something older and more private than any courtroom declaration, finally found its way into words. She had grown used to him by then, used to the particular rhythm of his boots on the porch, used to the way he ate everything on his plate now, every meal, where before he'd once pushed food around and called it enough. He found her one evening in the kitchen, flour on her hands, working dough by lamplight, because she could not sleep and did not want to waste the wakefulness. He watched her a while from the doorway before he spoke. "I've never asked you again," he said. "Since that first wagon ride. Your name, the one your mother gave you." Tabitha's hands stilled on the dough. "You didn't push," she said. "I remember. Didn't seem my place to, back then," he said. "We were strangers wearing the same name, and I figured a person's true name was hers to give, not mine to take." He paused, turning his hat over once in his hands the way he still did before saying something that mattered. "I'm not asking to take it now either. I'm only telling you I'd like to know it. If you're willing." Tabitha looked at him a long moment in the lamplight. This man who had stood in a crowded courtroom and told an entire county the truth of his heart, and who had still, even after all of that, waited a full winter for her to be the one to open this particular door. She told him. Said it slow, the way her mother used to say it, the syllables carrying the shape of a desert morning and a grinding stone, and a mother's hands guiding hers, a name that had belonged only to the two of them for 8 careful years, spoken for the first time inside a house that had stopped feeling borrowed a long while back. Jed said it back to her. Careful, a little clumsy. The way a man is clumsy with something he understands is precious before he's learned to hold it properly. She did not correct him. It was close enough. It was, she thought, watching him say it a second time, softer now, more sure it was hers to share, and she had chosen, finally, to share it, and that choosing mattered more than any man's perfect pronunciation ever could. "I choose this," she said then, the words rising up unplanned, though they were true regardless. "I choose you. I have, I think, for a while now." Jed crossed the kitchen and took her floured hands in his, not minding the mess at all, and kissed her there in the lamplight, the way a man kisses something he has finally understood he is allowed to want. Spring found them on a road neither had expected to travel together. Dust rising behind a wagon headed south toward San Carlos, toward a small adobe house Jed had heard described 100 times in letters and never once seen with his own eyes. The agency gate took longer to pass through than either of them liked. Papers checked twice, purpose questioned by a clerk who eyed Jed's wedding band and Tabitha's careful composure with the same practiced suspicion. Tabitha remembered from her own departure, years no months, though it felt like years before. Married, Jed told the clerk when asked his business. "Come to see my wife's mother." The clerk looked between them a long moment, something in his bored expression shifting slightly, though he said nothing further, only stamped the paper and waved them through. Tabitha's mother met them at the door, steadier on her feet than her last letter had suggested, and looked at her daughter a long moment before she looked at the man beside her. "So," she said finally, "this is the one who finally learned to fold dough properly." Jed laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, and Tabitha felt the last of her guardedness give way, quiet and complete, the way ice finally lets go of a river once spring has truly arrived. Doyle had come too, at his own quiet insistence, and he stood a little apart in the doorway, hat in his hands, until Tabitha's mother turned her sharp, careful eyes on him. "I know your face," she said, not unkindly, not kindly either, simply certain. "I expect you do, ma'am," Doyle said. "I've come a long way to say I'm sorry for the man I used to be. I don't expect it to undo anything. I only know silence never once made anything right, and I was tired of choosing silence." Tabitha's mother studied him a long, careful moment, the same weighing look. Tabitha remembered from a lifetime of watching her mother judge which roots were safe to eat, and which would poison a careless hand. Then she nodded. Once, the way a woman nods when a debt long left unspoken has finally, imperfectly, begun to be paid. "Sit is coffee. It is not as good as my daughter's. Nothing ever will be again." They sat, all of them. A rancher, an old soldier, a woman who had spent 8 years being underestimated by everyone, who'd never bothered to taste what she was capable of, and the mother who had taught her every bit of it around a small table. In a small house, on land that had never been quite anyone's and was, for one bright spring afternoon, entirely theirs to share. Before they left, Tabitha's mother pressed something small into Jed's hand, a single seed, dry and unremarkable, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. Mesquite, she said. Plant it near your kitchen door. When it grows tall enough to shade the step, you'll know your family has finally put down roots deep enough to last. Jed turned the seed over carefully in his palm, as though it weighed more than its size would suggest. I'll plant it tomorrow, he said. He did. A year turned, then another, and the mesquite by the kitchen door grew slow, but steady the way most worthwhile things do. Its thin branches finally, by the second summer, casting a ribbon of shade across the step, where Tabitha stood most mornings before dawn, coaxing the old stove awake the way she had that very first morning, a lifetime and 2 winters ago, both at once. Letters still traveled south to San Carlos every week, in Tabitha's steady hand, and some weeks now, they traveled back too, her mother's writing grown a little less shaky, a little more hopeful, full of news about a garden she'd started keeping again, the whole desert alphabet taught now to a niece who'd shown an interest, the knowledge passing forward the way all worthwhile knowledge eventually does. On the second anniversary of that first silent breakfast, the one where 12 men had gone quiet over a pot of biscuits, afraid in their own rough way of jinxing something none of them yet understood, Tabitha set a full table again, the whole crew gathered. Doyle at his usual seat, favoring his left knee and still refusing to admit it. Boone taller now, steadier, teaching patience to the younger hands who'd since joined the outfit. Silas and Jonah easy with each other the way men get when they trust the ground they're standing on. Jed rose partway through supper, coffee cup in hand, and cleared his throat the way he still did, before saying anything he considered important. 2 years ago tonight, he said, this whole outfit sat around this table and didn't say a word, because none of us knew yet what we were looking at. He glanced at Tabitha, something warm and unguarded in his face that had taken the better part of those 2 years to arrive there fully. I know now. I expect most of you have known a good while longer than I let myself admit. Took you long enough. Doyle's dry, and the table laughed, easy, the particular laughter of people who trusted each other enough to tease without wounding. To Mrs. Colton, Jed said, raising his cup, who came here for a roof and a purpose and gave this whole outfit considerably more than either. To Mrs. Colton, the table echoed, cups raised, and Tabitha, sitting at the foot of a table that had once belonged to a dying woman's grief and now belonged, plainly entirely, to something else, felt her throat go tight in a way she no longer bothered fighting. She had promised herself once, a lifetime ago, standing in a dead woman's borrowed bedroom, that she would not cry in front of walls that couldn't be trusted to keep a secret. These walls, she thought, blinking hard, looking around the table at every face gathered there. Doyle's weathered kindness, Boone's steady loyalty, Silas's quiet competence, Jonah's easy warmth, and Jed, watching her with an expression she no longer needed arithmetic to understand these particular walls, she had long since decided, could be trusted with anything at all. She let herself cry, just a little, right there at the table, and nobody thought any less of her for it. If anything, Boone said later, helping her clear the plates, it was about time somebody around here let the rest of us see it too. Tabitha thought, drying the last of the dishes that night, of a woman nobody had once thought to ask what she could do, of a courthouse clerk who'd barely looked up from his ledger, of a mother's hand against her cheek in the pre-dawn cold, telling her she had never been a small person. Worth, she had learned, was never something a banker's smile or a whispered rumor had the power to assign. It only ever needed the right table, and the patience to wait for someone finally to sit down and taste it. She had found hers. She intended to keep it.